The room has forgotten daylight long before the child has. Morning arrives only as a thinner darkness leaking through the edges of a blanket pinned across a small window, its light softened until it scarcely resembles the sun that once crossed open streets. Dust hangs motionless in the narrow beam that escapes beneath the cloth, and even the air seems careful not to disturb the silence. Somewhere above, footsteps travel across wooden floorboards with the ordinary confidence of people allowed to exist openly. Down here, every sound belongs to someone who must remain unheard. Before you follow these quiet lives behind doors that history seldom opened, take a moment to settle into the silence with us. If these calm journeys through the hidden corners of history bring you reflection or rest, consider subscribing, leaving a quiet word below, or simply returning when another forgotten story calls. Your presence helps preserve these voices that endured by leaving so few traces. You're listening to Echoes of War. A woman sits beside the child before either of them has spoken. She has already been awake for hours, listening to the building settle as timber contracts against the cool morning, measuring each familiar creak against those that do not belong. The small stove has gone cold during the night to avoid smoke that might linger too long above the chimney. A blanket rests across both their shoulders, less for warmth than for reassurance. In this room, comfort is rarely found in objects. It lives instead in routine, repeated so faithfully that uncertainty can be held at the edge of every day without completely entering it. The child watches her face before asking the question that has become part of nearly every morning. Not whether breakfast will come, nor whether it will rain beyond the walls, but whether today they may look outside for a little longer. She does not answer immediately. Instead, she reaches toward the window, lifting one corner of the blanket by no more than the width of a finger. Through the narrow gap appears a fragment of another world. The pale wall of a neighboring house, the lower branches of a chestnut tree, and a patch of sky carrying clouds toward somewhere that still measures time by ordinary concerns. The blanket falls back into place almost at once. Across occupied Europe, countless mornings begin with similarly careful gestures. The names of cities differ. So do the languages spoken beyond the walls, the uniforms passing through the streets, and the architecture of the houses that have become places of concealment. Yet within attics above workshops, beneath farmhouses, inside false walls, monastery cellars, abandoned storage rooms, forest shelters, and cramped spaces never intended for human life, another rhythm quietly unfolds. It is a rhythm measured not by clocks but by caution, where every movement must first ask permission from silence. You observe these hidden rooms without crossing their thresholds. They reveal remarkably little at first. A narrow mattress on rough boards. A tin cup carefully repaired more than once. Folded clothing worn thin from years rather than fashion. Children's drawings made on scraps of paper too precious to waste. The spaces seem almost empty until patience uncovers their true weight. Every object remains because replacing it is impossible. Every possession carries the memory of the ordinary life left behind, and every corner has slowly learned the shape of waiting. Many of the mothers who inhabit these rooms had once measured their days through familiar domestic routines that existed across every corner of Europe. They prepared meals, mended clothes, soothed childhood fears, celebrated birthdays, and worried about illnesses that belonged to ordinary families. Their work rarely attracted notice because ordinary motherhood seldom does. War did not erase those instincts. It redirected them toward an entirely different purpose. The preparation of food became the careful division of impossibly small portions. Cleaning became the removal of every trace that another human being existed. Comfort became the quiet invention of hope where evidence for hope grew increasingly difficult to find. Outside, occupation transformed neighborhoods through regulations, inspections, uniforms, and fear. Inside these hidden rooms, another transformation unfolded with far less visibility. A mother gradually learned how to explain silence to a child too young to understand politics. She discovered ways to calm restless bodies that could not run across fields or schoolyards. She memorized which floorboards creaked, which hours were safest for movement, and how long a cough might be suppressed before it became dangerous in a different way. These were not heroic acts performed once beneath dramatic circumstances. They became ordinary tasks repeated so often that endurance itself assumed the appearance of routine. The history of war often remembers armies because armies leave records. Governments preserve orders, battlefields preserve monuments, and campaigns reshape maps. Yet hidden within those vast movements lived families whose greatest achievement was leaving almost no trace at all while they remained alive. Their success depended upon invisibility so complete that history itself nearly passed over the quiet labor required to sustain it. Among them were mothers whose daily decisions rarely altered the course of military operations but determined whether a child would survive another week, another month, or another winter hidden from a world determined to find them. There is no single doorway through which this story begins. Some families arrive at concealment after hurried departures in the middle of the night, carrying little more than a suitcase whose contents have already been reduced to necessity. Others leave homes one careful visit at a time, placing treasured belongings with neighbors until even familiar rooms appear strangely empty. Some are guided by relatives, others by strangers whose names they have only just learned, and many never know whether the person opening a door is offering sanctuary or inviting catastrophe. The decision is seldom made because hiding promises safety. It is made because every visible alternative has steadily disappeared. The roads leading toward concealment pass through landscapes that continue to resemble ordinary Europe. Church bells still mark the hours. Market squares continue to fill, though often with fewer voices than before. Trains arrive according to schedules that conceal very different purposes beneath their appearance of routine. Fields ripen beneath the same summer sun that had warmed generations before the war, while forests remain indifferent to borders drawn by governments. Nature rarely announces that human civilization has crossed into something extraordinary. It simply continues, leaving people themselves to recognize how profoundly their own world has changed. For mothers, concealment requires a quiet redefinition of nearly every instinct that once guided family life. A child's curiosity, ordinarily encouraged, now becomes something to soften and redirect. Laughter, once welcomed as proof of happiness, must sometimes be quieted before it carries through walls. Tears cannot always be answered immediately if another sound above the ceiling suggests unfamiliar footsteps. Even affection changes its rhythm. A comforting embrace becomes not only an expression of love but also a reminder to remain still, to breathe slowly, to understand without explanation why silence has become another member of the household. The children experience these transformations differently according to their age. Some remember the homes they left with remarkable clarity, preserving every room as though memory itself were another place of refuge. Others are too young to distinguish between ordinary childhood and life inside confinement. Their understanding of the outside world gradually narrows until the hidden room becomes the center from which all imagination expands. A single glimpse through a cracked shutter may carry the excitement of an entire journey. The changing color of leaves outside one small window can replace seasons that are no longer lived but only observed from a distance. Time itself acquires unfamiliar qualities within these concealed spaces. Days lose the sharp edges that once separated work from rest, weekdays from holidays, celebration from routine. Instead, time becomes physical. It is counted through loaves of bread carefully divided, candles gradually shortened, clothing slowly outgrown by children who continue to grow despite every attempt by the war to interrupt ordinary life. The body measures passing months as surely as any calendar. Shoes become tighter. Sleeves become shorter. Voices deepen. Childhood refuses to pause, even when the world beyond the walls seems determined to suspend every other certainty. You begin to notice that waiting is never empty. It is filled with countless acts so small they rarely survive in official histories. A blanket is folded to soften a wooden floor. A whispered lesson continues because education cannot entirely disappear. A lullaby is remembered without being sung aloud. A mother studies her child's face in the dim light, quietly searching for signs of illness before symptoms become impossible to conceal. The war enters these rooms not only through danger but through the steady accumulation of interrupted ordinary moments, each one carrying a weight far greater than its size would suggest. Not every place of hiding resembles another. Some families live beneath generous farmers who risk everything by sharing food from already limited harvests. Others survive above workshops where every hammer strike conceals different sounds beneath the floor. Monasteries, orphanages, abandoned buildings, forests, barns, and city apartments all become temporary worlds with their own rhythms, their own rules, and their own fragile agreements between those hidden and those choosing to protect them. The environments change, yet the condition remains remarkably constant. Every shelter asks the same quiet question each morning: can another day pass unnoticed? This documentary will remain with those questions rather than rushing toward their answers. It will linger where history often moved too quickly, inside rooms whose silence concealed years rather than moments. It will return again and again to the ordinary work of preserving childhood beneath extraordinary pressure, observing how routines slowly changed, how seasons passed unseen, how hope contracted and expanded alongside the spaces in which families lived, and how motherhood itself adapted without surrendering its deepest purpose. The story unfolds not through dramatic escapes or famous names, but through the long discipline of remaining unseen while continuing, against every pressure surrounding them, to remain a family. The house that slowly disappears. There is no precise morning when a family understands that its home has begun to vanish. The walls remain where they have always stood. Curtains still move gently whenever the window is opened for fresh air. The familiar table continues to gather plates for the evening meal, and the cupboard still carries the faint scent of flour, dried herbs, and polished wood. Nothing visible announces that the ordinary order of life has begun to withdraw. Instead, disappearance arrives quietly, settling over familiar rooms so gradually that memory often recognizes the change only after it has already taken place. The mother notices small alterations before anyone else speaks of them aloud. A neighbor who once stopped to exchange a few pleasant words now lowers her eyes and walks past more quickly than before. Another offers a polite greeting that seems rehearsed, as though ordinary kindness has become something requiring careful thought. Deliveries that always arrived on certain days become less reliable. Familiar shopkeepers hesitate before opening conversations. Newspapers grow heavier with official notices that seem written in language designed to sound administrative while quietly narrowing the boundaries of everyday life. Each individual change appears manageable. Together, they begin to reshape the invisible geography of belonging. You watch these streets from a respectful distance, long before concealment has entered the family's imagination. Children still chase one another across narrow pavements after school. Bicycle wheels click over uneven stones polished by generations of passing feet. Bakers lift warm loaves from ovens before dawn, while church bells continue marking hours with reassuring regularity. The routines of the neighborhood persist because communities rarely abandon their habits all at once. Life often appears most ordinary just before it quietly becomes something else. For Jewish families across occupied Europe, exclusion seldom begins with dramatic confrontation inside the home itself. It enters through accumulating restrictions that gradually transform movement into calculation. A familiar park is no longer visited because it has become unwise rather than impossible. A favorite cafe quietly disappears from family routines without explanation offered to the youngest children. Invitations cease arriving. Journeys become shorter. Conversations become more careful. The home absorbs these absences one by one until it begins performing another function beyond shelter. It becomes the final place where ordinary identity still feels intact. The mother carries this changing world with remarkable restraint. She folds laundry while mentally rearranging plans that no longer seem dependable. She prepares meals with ingredients increasingly difficult to obtain, making each portion appear generous despite growing scarcity. At night, after the children have fallen asleep, she sits beside a dim lamp with letters spread across the table, reading familiar handwriting from relatives whose own circumstances have become uncertain. Some messages speak cautiously, avoiding details that cannot safely travel through official channels. Others stop arriving altogether. Silence begins occupying places where words once lived. The father, where he remains present, often studies newspapers with unusual concentration, searching not only for events but for patterns hidden beneath official language. Friends visit less frequently than before, yet when they do, conversations continue long after cups have emptied. Their voices remain low even though no immediate danger waits outside the windows. Rumors move faster than verified information, and uncertainty gradually becomes part of the household's furniture. The children notice these gatherings without understanding their purpose. They remember only that the adults have begun speaking in incomplete sentences, falling silent whenever younger ears enter the room. Objects inside the house slowly acquire unexpected significance. A family photograph displayed openly for years is removed from the mantel and placed carefully inside a drawer, not because its faces have become less precious, but because visible evidence of ordinary life has begun requiring protection. Important documents are gathered into envelopes whose location changes every few days. Jewelry inherited across generations is wrapped inside cloth and hidden among everyday possessions where it appears least valuable. Books are sorted, clothing repaired rather than replaced, and small practical decisions quietly accumulate into preparations that no one wishes to describe by their true purpose. The rhythm of domestic work continues because it must. Floors are swept. Windows are cleaned. Bread is sliced with the same familiar knife that has served the family for years. Yet beneath these ordinary movements another rhythm steadily emerges. Every routine now carries a second question that had never before accompanied it. Will this still matter next month? The uncertainty rarely interrupts the work itself. Instead, it settles gently beside it, accompanying every familiar task like a shadow that lengthens without drawing immediate attention to its presence. There are evenings when the mother stands at an upstairs window after the children have gone to bed, looking across rooftops touched by the fading light. Chimneys release thin columns of smoke into cooling air, and somewhere nearby a piano drifts through an open window before disappearing beneath the ordinary sounds of the town preparing for night. Nothing in the landscape openly declares that countless families are beginning to measure their futures differently. Yet beneath the quiet beauty of the evening lies an unmistakable sense that the world has shifted by degrees too small to see all at once. Homes that once promised permanence have begun, almost imperceptibly, to teach their occupants how to leave. Morning continues to arrive with reassuring regularity, yet its meaning slowly changes. The mother still opens the shutters where it remains safe to do so, allowing pale light to spill across the kitchen floor as she prepares breakfast from whatever ingredients have been carefully set aside. Steam rises from a pot with familiar warmth, carrying scents that have filled the house for years. The children settle into their places at the table with the quiet impatience that belongs to ordinary childhood. For a few precious minutes, the room belongs entirely to the habits that existed before the occupation, and it becomes possible to imagine that routine itself possesses the strength to resist history. Beyond the windows, however, ordinary life begins revealing small absences. Certain neighbors no longer pass the house at the same hours. Shop signs that had remained unchanged for decades quietly disappear, replaced by shutters that remain closed throughout the day. Streets once known for conversation become places where greetings shorten into careful nods before both people continue walking. Fear rarely announces itself through dramatic gestures. More often, it teaches entire communities to speak less than they once did, until silence itself begins shaping public life. You notice how the children continue searching for normality in ways that adults no longer can. They invent games using worn buttons, scraps of string, and smooth stones gathered before the world became complicated. They argue over small things, forget yesterday's worries for an afternoon, and laugh with the complete sincerity that only childhood permits. Their mother watches these moments with quiet gratitude, not because she believes they will last unchanged, but because every ordinary afternoon now feels less like an expectation and more like a gift that cannot be counted upon returning tomorrow. The house gradually becomes a place where conversations divide themselves according to who is present. At the table, discussion remains gentle, centered on meals, weather, books, and the comforting repetition of familiar subjects. After bedtime, chairs move closer together, lamps burn lower, and entirely different conversations begin. Friends who still dare to visit remove their coats slowly, listening before they speak, as though the walls themselves have acquired unfamiliar responsibilities. Maps appear beside folded newspapers. Addresses are written down, then committed to memory before the paper is quietly destroyed. Names of distant relatives are spoken with increasing uncertainty, each one followed by a pause that no one knows how to fill. These evenings rarely produce immediate decisions. Instead, they become exercises in imagining futures that change from week to week. One rumor suggests the restrictions may ease. Another claims they will tighten further. Someone knows a family that has already left for the countryside. Someone else insists that remaining at home is still the safest choice. No one possesses complete information, yet everyone understands that waiting indefinitely carries its own risks. The burden of uncertainty settles unevenly across the room, touching each adult differently according to age, temperament, and the responsibilities they quietly carry. For the mothers, planning acquires an intensely practical character. They do not merely ask where the family might go if departure becomes necessary. They ask what a frightened child can realistically carry without becoming exhausted. They consider which blanket provides the greatest warmth for the least weight, which family photograph should accompany them if only a handful can be saved, and whether a favorite toy offers enough comfort to justify the precious space it occupies inside a small suitcase. These decisions appear almost ordinary when viewed individually. Together they reveal how deeply war has entered the private geography of family life. Seasonal rhythms continue regardless of human plans. Spring rain darkens cobblestones before drying beneath gentle sunshine. Laundry flutters between neighboring houses, children chase drifting leaves, and gardens begin producing the first vegetables of the year. Nature offers no indication that countless families are quietly preparing for possibilities they cannot yet name. The apple trees blossom with the same patient confidence they displayed before the war, while birds continue constructing nests beneath rooflines where hidden anxieties steadily accumulate inside the rooms below. The contrast is striking not because nature appears indifferent, but because it faithfully preserves continuity at precisely the moment human society begins abandoning it. The mother increasingly commits the house to memory while still living inside it. Her hand lingers briefly against the polished banister worn smooth by generations of family footsteps. She pauses while folding tablecloths embroidered by her own mother years before, noticing details she had stopped consciously seeing because they had always been present. The familiar sound of the front gate closing, the angle of afternoon sunlight across the sitting room, the faint scent of soap rising from freshly washed linen. Each ordinary sensation quietly assumes the character of farewell long before anyone speaks the word aloud. The house itself has not changed. Yet within its walls, every familiar object has begun participating in the slow, almost invisible process of becoming a memory before it has even been left behind. Doors opened by quiet courage. The decision to leave rarely arrives with the certainty people imagine afterward. History often compresses difficult choices into single moments because single moments are easier to remember. The lived experience is quieter. It unfolds through evenings filled with unfinished conversations, mornings interrupted by new restrictions, and afternoons when another familiar face quietly disappears from the neighborhood. Gradually, what once seemed unimaginable begins to resemble the only remaining path. The house that had protected the family for years can no longer promise that tomorrow will resemble yesterday. The mother wakes before dawn on the morning they depart, though she has slept very little. The rooms are unusually still, as if the house itself senses that its familiar rhythm is nearing an end. She walks softly through each space without lighting unnecessary lamps, allowing memory to guide her where sight is no longer needed. Her hands rest briefly upon the kitchen table, smoothing a cloth that will remain behind. A chair stands slightly away from the others after the previous evening's conversation, and she quietly returns it to its place. The gesture serves no practical purpose. Some habits continue simply because they belong to a life that has not yet completely slipped away. Packing proves stranger than expected. The family owns far more than they can carry, yet choosing what remains behind feels less like selecting possessions than deciding which memories deserve a physical companion. Warm clothing naturally finds its place. So do important papers folded carefully inside waterproof wrapping. Medicines, if available, are tucked into corners of bags already growing heavier than anyone wishes to admit. Beside these necessities lie quieter objects whose value cannot be measured through usefulness alone. A small prayer book with softened pages, a photograph showing grandparents standing beneath summer trees many years earlier, a child's knitted scarf repaired so often that its original stitches are almost impossible to distinguish from later ones. You observe these preparations without haste. Every object lifted from a shelf briefly reconnects the family to an ordinary afternoon when it first entered the house. A ceramic cup recalls countless breakfasts whose simplicity once made them forgettable. A sewing needle carries the memory of winter evenings spent repairing clothes while children listen to stories. Even the suitcase itself bears scratches gathered through happier journeys taken before borders acquired entirely different meanings. In peaceful times, households quietly accumulate histories inside everyday possessions. Under persecution, those silent histories suddenly demand impossible choices. The children sense that something unusual is happening, though explanations remain carefully measured according to age. One notices that favorite books have disappeared from their usual shelf. Another asks why breakfast is eaten more quickly than normal or why voices remain lower than they had only a week before. Their questions are honest rather than fearful, for children often trust that adults possess reasons even when those reasons remain hidden. The mother answers gently, never promising what she cannot know, yet always preserving enough certainty to keep fear from becoming the center of the morning. Outside, the street appears remarkably unchanged. Milk carts continue their familiar routes. Workers make their way toward factories and workshops. A woman sweeps dust from her doorstep while exchanging a few quiet words with a passing neighbor. The ordinary choreography of civilian life unfolds with almost unsettling precision, reminding anyone watching how history can conceal itself beneath routines that outwardly remain intact. Few people passing along these streets know that behind one particular front door a family is preparing to vanish from public view. Fewer still understand how many similar departures are quietly unfolding elsewhere, each one hidden inside the countless private decisions that never appear in official records. Not every departure begins with immediate concealment. Some families move first between trusted relatives, remaining only a few nights before continuing onward. Others accept temporary shelter offered by acquaintances whose friendship suddenly demands extraordinary courage. The geography of survival becomes fluid, shaped less by distance than by trust. A farmhouse only a few kilometers away may prove safer than another city. An attic above a familiar workshop may offer greater security than a larger building filled with strangers. Every route reflects not military strategy but human relationships patiently built over years before the occupation transformed kindness into risk. For those who opened their homes, every knock at the door carried consequences extending far beyond hospitality. Offering shelter meant accepting dangers that reached entire households. Parents considered not only their own safety but that of their children sleeping in nearby rooms. Elderly relatives living under the same roof became unwilling participants in decisions made from conscience rather than obligation. Yet throughout occupied Europe, thousands nevertheless chose to widen the boundaries of their own lives to include people whom persecution had stripped of ordinary refuge. Their courage often appeared remarkably undramatic. A meal quietly shared. A spare room prepared without ceremony. A whispered agreement that another family would simply remain until circumstances changed, even though no one could predict when, or whether, that day might arrive. The mother understands that accepting such help creates a burden she wishes she did not have to place upon anyone else. Gratitude arrives intertwined with guilt, for survival now depends not solely upon her own caution but upon the continued generosity and discretion of others. As she gathers the children close before stepping across the threshold for what may be the final time, she looks once through the familiar hallway where morning light falls exactly as it always has. Nothing within the house asks them to leave. The danger waits beyond its walls, invisible yet undeniable. Quietly, without farewell that might attract attention, the door closes behind them, and the life they have known begins receding not through distance alone, but through the irreversible act of walking away from home while hoping only to preserve the people who once filled it. The journey toward concealment seldom follows a straight line. A family may leave home believing they are traveling to one destination, only to learn that plans have quietly changed during the night. A trusted address is no longer considered safe. A courier fails to arrive. A railway station once thought manageable has become heavily watched. Decisions are revised with little explanation, not because those guiding the escape wish to keep secrets from the family, but because certainty itself has become increasingly scarce. Adaptation is no longer an interruption to the journey. It becomes the journey. The mother gradually learns to read expressions more carefully than words. A slight hesitation before someone answers the door may reveal as much as an entire conversation. A host's smile, though sincere, often carries the unmistakable weight of responsibility. Even kindness acquires a quiet tension, for everyone understands that hospitality now extends beyond sharing food or offering a bed. It asks ordinary civilians to stand between another family and the machinery of persecution, often without knowing how long that responsibility will endure. The welcome is genuine, yet beneath it lies an awareness that every additional day brings new uncertainties for everyone beneath the same roof. You notice how quickly children adapt to unfamiliar surroundings when guided by familiar voices. A spare bedroom with plain white walls becomes acceptable because their mother sits beside them. A narrow mattress spread across a farmhouse loft feels less frightening when bedtime stories continue, even if they are whispered rather than spoken aloud. Childhood possesses an extraordinary ability to search for normality inside altered circumstances. A window overlooking fields replaces one that once faced city streets. The creaking of old beams becomes the new sound of night. For a little while, routine begins rebuilding itself around whatever shelter has been found. Yet every temporary refuge carries an invisible clock. Families offering protection often cannot do so indefinitely, even when their willingness remains unwavering. Neighbors notice unfamiliar movements. Deliveries become difficult to explain. Food that once comfortably supplied one household must now sustain several. The strain rarely appears through dramatic conflict. Instead, it accumulates quietly in practical details. Longer queues for bread, more laundry drying discreetly indoors, additional footsteps that must remain unheard whenever visitors approach. The generosity of the hosts does not diminish. The complexity of preserving secrecy simply grows heavier with each passing week. In many places, networks of assistance begin forming through relationships that had existed long before the war. A schoolteacher quietly speaks with a local priest. A shopkeeper knows someone living beyond the town. A doctor remembers a farming family whose isolated property might provide temporary shelter. These connections seldom resemble the orderly systems later described in historical accounts. They are built instead from countless acts of trust exchanged between ordinary people who often know only a small portion of the wider effort. Each participant sees only a few links in the chain, yet together those links sustain lives that would otherwise have nowhere to go. The mothers moving through these networks carry more than bags and children. They carry the difficult responsibility of preserving calm while privately measuring every unfamiliar place against questions that can never be answered with certainty. Is this room quiet enough? Does the child understand when silence is necessary? Can illness be managed here if winter arrives? Are the people offering protection truly safe, or simply determined to be brave despite risks they themselves cannot fully calculate? Such questions accompany every new shelter, settling into the mind before the family's belongings have even been unpacked. Nature often provides the only sense of continuity amid these changing refuges. The same wind moves across forests and villages regardless of who hides beneath their roofs. Rain falls equally upon occupied cities and isolated farms. Evening light stretches across harvested fields with the same quiet patience it displayed before the war, reminding those who pause to notice that the seasons continue their ancient rhythm even while human lives are repeatedly uprooted. A child may remember little about the names of the places through which the family passes, yet years later still recall the scent of damp earth after autumn rain or the soft rustling of leaves outside a barn where, for a few peaceful nights, fear seemed momentarily more distant. Eventually, one destination remains while the others fall away. It is not necessarily larger, safer, or more comfortable than the temporary shelters that came before. Often it is smaller than any home the family has previously known. Yet it possesses one essential quality that every earlier refuge lacked: the possibility of remaining hidden for longer than a handful of uncertain days. The room may lie behind a false wall, beneath the floor of an ordinary house, above a workshop where daily labor conceals quieter sounds overhead, or within the attic of a farmhouse where hay, timber, and darkness combine to obscure human presence. The family steps inside carrying little more than what they can hold. The door closes gently, without ceremony. Outside, the world continues its familiar movement. Inside, another existence quietly begins, one that will be measured not by journeys across landscapes, but by the patient discipline of remaining unseen within a single, carefully guarded space. Rooms measured by silence. The first days inside a permanent hiding place rarely feel permanent. The family continues behaving as though departure might come tomorrow, keeping belongings packed, arranging blankets so they can be gathered quickly, and listening for instructions that never seem to arrive. The room itself remains unfamiliar despite its limited size. Every wall, every beam, every loose floorboard must be understood not simply as part of a shelter, but as part of a system upon which survival now depends. Home is no longer defined by comfort. It is defined by concealment. The mother begins learning the character of the room with the same patient attention she once devoted to an ordinary household. She discovers where the morning light briefly touches the floor before retreating for the remainder of the day. She notices which boards creak beneath careful footsteps and which remain silent even under greater weight. She learns how sound travels through the walls, identifying the difference between voices from the street, footsteps in the rooms above, and the familiar movements of those protecting them. Within a remarkably short time, these observations become instinctive. The room ceases to be unknown. It becomes intimately understood, though never entirely accepted. You remain beside the quiet routine without disturbing it. At first glance, very little appears to happen. Blankets are folded. Cups are rinsed with carefully rationed water. Clothing is mended under dim light that must never become visible from outside. Yet stillness proves deceptive. Every ordinary action has been altered by conditions invisible to an outside observer. A chair cannot simply be moved whenever convenient if scraping wood across the floor might carry downward or upward through the building. A window cannot be opened merely because fresh air is desired. Even a whispered conversation unconsciously adjusts itself according to the sounds drifting through the walls. The children explore the boundaries of their new world with remarkable seriousness. They count the steps from one wall to another until the number becomes familiar. Small cracks in old timber transform into landscapes for imagination. Knots in wooden boards become faces, mountains, or islands known only to them. Their games require almost no movement, yet childhood continues searching for possibility wherever space permits it. The mother watches these quiet inventions with mixed emotions. She is grateful that imagination survives. She also recognizes how swiftly confinement teaches children to expect less from the world than they once did. Daily life settles into rhythms dictated almost entirely by others. Meals arrive when it is considered safe. Water is brought according to opportunities rather than convenience. Waste must be managed with extraordinary care, often requiring complicated arrangements timed around the routines of the household above. Those offering protection continue their own lives while quietly sustaining another hidden existence beneath or beside their own. The mothers never mistake these acts for obligation. Every loaf of bread carried upstairs or quietly placed beside a concealed entrance represents another decision to continue accepting danger on behalf of strangers who have gradually become something closer to family. Silence itself becomes layered. There is the comfortable silence of shared presence, when everyone understands that words are unnecessary. There is the disciplined silence observed during daylight hours, when ordinary activity elsewhere in the building demands complete stillness below. Then there is another silence altogether, one that descends unexpectedly whenever unfamiliar footsteps pause outside, whenever a vehicle stops nearby for longer than expected, or whenever voices carry a tone that no one recognizes. During these moments, breathing becomes slower almost without conscious effort, and even children instinctively look toward their mothers before making the smallest movement. The mother discovers that protecting a child inside hiding involves far more than keeping them physically unseen. Fear cannot be permitted to fill every hour, because fear itself eventually becomes another form of imprisonment. She quietly invents routines whose purpose reaches beyond practical necessity. Mornings begin with washing as thoroughly as circumstances allow. Lessons continue using scraps of paper preserved for repeated use. Stories are told from memory, sometimes interrupted so frequently by necessary pauses that children learn patience alongside the tales themselves. Songs are remembered without always being sung. Holidays, where possible, are acknowledged through gestures so modest they might escape the attention of anyone not living inside the room. These routines preserve more than time. They preserve identity. As weeks lengthen into months, the room slowly acquires the appearance of permanence despite everyone's determination to believe otherwise. Blankets find habitual places. Books, few though they may be, become worn through repeated reading. Children's drawings accumulate in corners where they brighten rough timber with quiet evidence that imagination refuses to surrender completely. The shelter begins absorbing the family's presence just as their former home once had. Yet unlike that earlier house, this place is built upon absence. Every improvement remains temporary. Every habit exists alongside the hope that one day it will no longer be necessary. Until that day arrives, the room continues measuring life not through the distance one may travel, but through the extraordinary discipline required to remain almost perfectly still while the world beyond its walls continues turning without pause. As the first uncertainty of arrival gradually settles into routine, the room begins to develop its own quiet calendar. It is not marked by dates written upon paper, but by subtle changes that repeat often enough to become familiar. Morning light reaches a particular beam for only a few weeks before shifting with the season. The evenings cool earlier than they had a month before. Moisture gathers differently along the inside of the window, or upon the stone walls if the hiding place lies beneath the ground. The family learns these changes with remarkable precision because the world they now inhabit has become wonderfully small, allowing even the slightest variation to carry unexpected significance. The mother pays close attention to these rhythms because they offer a reassuring sense that time continues to move forward. In confinement, one of the greatest dangers is not merely fear, but the feeling that days have ceased to distinguish themselves from one another. She quietly resists this erosion by preserving gentle structure wherever circumstances permit. Mornings are reserved for washing, tidying, and lessons. Afternoons become hours for reading, sewing, quiet games, or simply listening while someone tells a story remembered from another life. Evening brings reflection, shared meals however modest they may be, and the careful preparation for another night whose safety can never be entirely guaranteed. You notice that ordinary domestic work has acquired extraordinary importance. Sweeping a small section of floor no longer serves only cleanliness. It declares that this hidden place remains a home rather than merely a refuge. Mending clothing means more than repairing fabric, for replacement has become almost impossible. Folding blankets each morning creates precious space within rooms where every movement must be negotiated with care. These tasks once belonged to the unnoticed background of everyday family life. Now they quietly uphold dignity itself, reminding everyone that civilization survives not only through great institutions but also through the repeated care people give to the smallest corners of their existence. Children continue growing despite the room's refusal to grow alongside them. Sleeves become shorter. Shoes begin pressing against toes that seem to lengthen almost overnight. A mother who once celebrated these signs of healthy childhood now receives them with mixed feelings. Growth is welcome because it means life continues. Yet every inch gained reminds her how long the family has remained hidden. Clothing must be altered using fabrics saved from garments already worn beyond repair. Blankets become smaller against lengthening legs. Beds that once accommodated restless sleep begin feeling noticeably confined. Time leaves its mark upon the body even when the world beyond the walls remains almost entirely unseen. Those providing shelter also find their routines quietly transformed. The woman who lives above the concealed room begins rising slightly earlier so additional bread can be baked before neighbors awaken. A farmer lingers longer inside the barn than his daily work strictly requires, allowing food or supplies to be passed unnoticed beneath loose floorboards. Someone delays emptying ash from a stove until darkness falls because certain movements now attract less attention after sunset. None of these adjustments appears dramatic in isolation. Together they reveal how acts of protection become woven into ordinary domestic life until courage itself assumes the appearance of routine. Sometimes, during carefully chosen hours when surrounding conditions permit, the mother is allowed to lift a covering from the small window for a little longer than usual. The children gather silently beside her. They watch clouds moving across a pale sky, leaves stirred by a gentle breeze, or rain tracing slow paths down old glass. Birds settle briefly upon nearby rooftops before continuing their journeys without hesitation. The view is astonishingly narrow, yet its emotional breadth feels immense. For several quiet minutes, the outside world ceases to be merely remembered. It becomes visible again, not as something possessed, but as something patiently witnessed from afar. These moments also reveal how differently adults and children experience confinement. The youngest often greet each glimpse with immediate delight, finding endless fascination in changing weather or passing animals. Their mother notices something else. She observes people walking freely along streets without measuring every step. She sees laundry drying openly in gardens, smoke rising naturally from chimneys, and neighbors pausing to exchange ordinary conversation at front gates. None of these scenes is remarkable in itself. What moves her is their effortless normality. Freedom announces itself not through grand gestures, but through countless ordinary actions that no longer require permission or calculation. Night restores a different kind of closeness. Once the building above grows quiet and those sheltering them have completed the visible routines of their own day, whispers become a little safer. Stories travel softly across the room. Parents recall places the children may barely remember, describing parks, rivers, market squares, or family gatherings in careful detail so memory does not gradually surrender them to silence. The children ask whether those places remain unchanged. No one answers too quickly. Outside, seasons continue passing over towns and forests, carrying leaves, snow, blossoms, and rain through landscapes that the hidden family can scarcely see. Inside, memory performs its own quiet labor, preserving a world that grows more distant with every passing month while nurturing the fragile hope that one day these stories will no longer describe somewhere lost, but somewhere waiting. The weight of invisible days. By the time another season settles across the countryside, the hidden room no longer feels borrowed. It has become the landscape within which nearly every ordinary human experience must now unfold. The family no longer measures life by journeys from one place to another, but by the subtle transformations occurring inside the same familiar walls. The grain of the timber seems more pronounced than before. Tiny cracks widen almost imperceptibly as the weather changes. Even the pattern of light crossing the floor acquires a familiarity once reserved for streets, gardens, and neighboring houses. Confinement has not become easier. It has become known. The mother senses this change with quiet concern. Adaptation is necessary for survival, yet she wonders what invisible cost accompanies it. There are mornings when the children wake without immediately asking about the outside world. Instead, they begin their small routines as though this room has always defined the limits of childhood. They fold blankets, wash as carefully as the available water allows, and settle beside one another for lessons written on reused scraps of paper. Their acceptance brings relief because it reduces daily distress. It also brings sorrow, for every sign of adjustment reminds her how much of ordinary life has already slipped beyond their experience. You remain beside these routines long enough to notice details that would otherwise disappear into repetition. A pencil grows shorter week after week until it must be wrapped with cloth to remain useful. A single candle is carefully trimmed so its light may last several more evenings. Thread pulled from worn garments is saved inside a small tin because even the smallest length may someday repair another piece of clothing. Nothing is discarded without first asking whether it might serve another purpose. Scarcity quietly reshapes imagination, encouraging careful invention where abundance once allowed convenience. Food arrives according to possibilities rather than appetite. Some days the portions are unexpectedly generous because conditions outside have briefly favored those providing assistance. At other times, meals become noticeably smaller without explanation. The mother rarely comments upon these fluctuations. Instead, she adjusts her own portion almost instinctively, ensuring the children notice fullness before they notice sacrifice. Such exchanges often occur without a single word being spoken. The language of care has become deeply practical, expressed through divided bread, shared soup, or the quiet insistence that someone else should eat first. Illness introduces another layer of uncertainty. A slight cough that would once have invited little concern now becomes something everyone quietly monitors. A fever cannot easily be explained away if a doctor cannot safely enter the hiding place. Medicines, when available at all, are precious beyond measure and often reserved until absolutely necessary. The mother spends long hours listening not only for sounds beyond the walls but also for changes in her children's breathing as they sleep. During peaceful times, illness belongs largely to medicine. Inside hiding, it also belongs to secrecy, patience, and hope. The changing seasons continue reaching the hidden room through indirect signs. In winter, cold settles into stone and timber long before snow becomes visible through the narrow window. Breath lingers faintly in the air during early mornings, and blankets acquire new importance as fuel grows increasingly difficult to spare. Spring announces itself through birdsong filtering faintly from outside and through longer hours of daylight that subtly alter the rhythm of the room. Summer brings warmer air but also greater caution, for open windows elsewhere in the building carry sounds farther than before. Autumn arrives with the scent of damp leaves drifting inside whenever a door briefly opens above them. Though largely unseen, the natural world continues marking time with remarkable faithfulness. Those offering shelter also begin carrying the quiet fatigue of prolonged vigilance. The extraordinary has gradually become ordinary for them as well. They remember which floorboards must be avoided, which neighbors have become unusually observant, and which daily routines provide the safest opportunities to deliver supplies. Their courage no longer announces itself through dramatic decisions. It resides instead within hundreds of disciplined habits maintained day after day without expectation of recognition. They continue tending gardens, attending church, repairing fences, or managing shops while privately carrying knowledge that could endanger every member of their household if care should falter even briefly. The emotional burden shared between those hidden and those protecting them often remains unspoken because words cannot easily lighten it. Gratitude deepens with every passing month, yet so too does the awareness that another family's ordinary life has been permanently altered by an act of compassion. The mother sometimes watches the woman who brings their meals lingering only briefly before returning upstairs. She notices new lines of weariness around her eyes, hands roughened by work that has quietly increased, and movements that reveal the accumulated weight of responsibilities extending far beyond those of an ordinary household. Neither woman speaks openly about these observations. Their understanding requires no explanation. Each recognizes that survival has become a partnership built not upon convenience, but upon countless shared acts of endurance repeated until they resemble the quiet rhythm of the seasons themselves. The hidden room gradually develops sounds that would have escaped notice during the first weeks of concealment. Wood responds differently as humidity rises and falls, producing soft clicks that become as familiar as the ticking of a clock once was. Water travels through old pipes with a slow, hollow murmur. Wind presses gently against the roof before moving on through nearby trees, and distant church bells continue measuring hours that the family no longer experiences in the same way as everyone outside. These quiet repetitions become reassuring because they belong to a world that continues behaving predictably, even when so much else does not. The mother often finds herself listening to the building above with increasing precision. She can distinguish the measured footsteps of the elderly man who rises before dawn from the lighter tread of the young woman who prepares breakfast each morning. She recognizes the scrape of a chair being moved before the evening meal and the familiar rhythm of someone carrying firewood indoors as colder weather approaches. These ordinary domestic sounds become companions of a peculiar sort. Though separated by walls and secrecy, two households slowly learn one another through routines rather than introductions. Their lives intertwine without ever enjoying the freedom of open companionship. You begin to notice another quiet transformation. The children no longer ask every day when they will return home. Instead, their questions become gentler and somehow more difficult to answer. They wonder whether the apple tree in the old garden still blossoms each spring. They ask if the family cat remembers them or whether neighbors still hang flowers from the windows overlooking the street. Their memories are becoming less immediate and more carefully preserved, as though ordinary life before hiding now belongs to the same fragile place where fairy tales and family stories quietly coexist. Childhood does not forget. It simply rearranges memory into forms that can be carried without constant sorrow. Learning continues with remarkable persistence despite the limitations surrounding it. Arithmetic is practiced upon scraps of paper whose margins have already been filled once before. Reading lessons return again and again to the same few treasured books until entire passages settle comfortably into memory. Geography becomes an unusual exercise, for places once visited freely now exist only through description. The mother traces rivers and mountain ranges with her finger across fading maps, encouraging the children to imagine landscapes they cannot safely see. Education, under such circumstances, becomes more than preparation for the future. It quietly declares faith that a future still deserves preparation. There are moments when discouragement settles over the room with a heaviness no practical routine can entirely dispel. News arrives slowly and often incompletely. Sometimes weeks pass without reliable information about relatives, friends, or entire communities left behind. A whispered report brought by those offering shelter may suggest hope one day and uncertainty the next. The mother receives each fragment with careful composure while privately assembling them into possibilities she rarely shares aloud. She has learned that children observe expressions long before they understand explanations. A calm face becomes another form of protection, even when certainty remains painfully absent. The helpers themselves cannot remain untouched by the prolonged strain. Each unexpected visitor to their home requires subtle adjustments. Every official inspection, however ordinary its stated purpose, briefly accelerates the heartbeat of everyone living beneath that roof. A cart stopping outside for longer than expected, unfamiliar voices lingering near the entrance, or questions asked with unusual curiosity all possess the power to transform an otherwise peaceful afternoon into hours of silent vigilance. Once the moment passes, daily routines quietly resume, yet they do not resume unchanged. Another layer of caution has settled upon the household, almost invisible yet unmistakably present. As months become difficult to distinguish from one another, The mother deliberately preserves small observances that connect the family to the passage of time. Birthdays are marked with whatever modest celebration circumstances allow, perhaps an extra slice of bread carefully saved or a tiny sweet offered after weeks of patient waiting. Religious festivals continue through whispered prayers, remembered traditions, or candles whose light burns only briefly before caution requires darkness once again. These observances are rarely elaborate, but they resist an important danger. They prevent survival from becoming merely the passage of empty days. They remind everyone that life remains something to be lived, not simply endured. Outside, forests surrender their leaves before accepting winter once more. Rivers continue flowing beneath ice that forms and disappears according to ancient rhythms untouched by politics or persecution. Fields are planted, harvested, and left to rest again while the hidden family measures those same seasons through changing temperatures inside a single room and the subtle alterations of light upon familiar walls. Nature keeps moving with immense patience, carrying the world steadily forward. Within the shelter, the family learns another form of patience entirely, one built not upon the certainty of what tomorrow will bring, but upon the quiet conviction that preserving kindness, learning, routine, and love inside the narrowest of spaces remains, day after day, a profound act of resistance against a world determined to extinguish them. The sound of danger drawing near. There comes a point in prolonged concealment when danger no longer feels like an occasional visitor. It settles into the rhythm of daily life with such consistency that the hidden family begins measuring each day not by the absence of fear, but by the degree to which fear remains manageable. The room itself has not changed. The blankets still cover the same beds. The shelves still hold the same carefully rationed supplies. Yet the atmosphere surrounding these familiar objects grows subtly heavier, as though the walls have quietly absorbed months of whispered concern and returned them in the form of a silence that demands greater attention than before. The mother notices the change first through those protecting them. Their smiles remain sincere, but they arrive a fraction later than they once did. Conversations become shorter, interrupted more often by listening before speaking again. Deliveries of food occur at less predictable hours because familiar routines have become easier for others to observe. No single alteration suggests immediate catastrophe. Together, they reveal a community slowly adjusting to pressures that continue accumulating beyond the walls of the hiding place. You remain with the family through these quiet adjustments rather than looking immediately toward larger historical events. A loaf of bread now arrives wrapped differently because the usual baker has attracted unwanted attention. Water must occasionally be stored for an extra day because movement through the house has become temporarily unsafe. A child who once spent an hour reading aloud each evening is gently asked to turn pages more slowly, for even paper possesses a sound when silence has become part of survival. These are changes almost invisible to anyone visiting for a few moments. For those living within the room, they reshape the entire texture of ordinary existence. Rumors begin traveling through occupied communities with increasing urgency. They rarely arrive complete. A whispered conversation overheard in a marketplace. A railway worker quietly passing along something seen during the previous week. A priest mentioning families who have vanished without explanation. Someone claims that inspections have become more frequent in neighboring villages. Another has heard that certain hiding places were discovered after entirely ordinary circumstances drew unwanted attention. Each story arrives carrying uncertainty, yet together they gradually alter how people evaluate even the smallest decisions. For mothers living in concealment, uncertainty proves more exhausting than certainty itself. A known danger allows preparation. An unknown one quietly occupies every possibility. Should the children continue their lessons today if unexpected movement becomes necessary? Is this cough simply the result of cold air, or something requiring precious medicine? Would remaining perfectly still during a search offer greater safety than attempting escape through another route? These questions seldom receive immediate answers. Instead, they accompany each day like silent companions, growing familiar without ever becoming comfortable. The children sense these changing currents despite every effort to shield them. They observe that the adults pause more frequently before speaking. They notice meals arriving later than expected or recognize that those bringing supplies now linger for shorter periods than before. Childhood continues searching for reassurance, often finding it in remarkably small gestures. A mother's hand resting gently upon a shoulder. A familiar story told once again before sleep. The careful folding of blankets each morning exactly as it has always been done. Routine becomes a language through which stability is communicated when explanations would only deepen fear. Beyond the shelter, the seasons continue their patient progression. Rain washes dust from rooftops before disappearing into narrow streets below. Frost gathers overnight upon fields where distant workers continue their tasks beneath pale skies. Smoke rises from chimneys in thin grey columns that drift across the morning air before dissolving completely. The world remains outwardly recognizable, yet within occupied communities an invisible tightening has begun. Regulations multiply. Suspicion spreads quietly between neighbors who once knew one another with uncomplicated trust. Ordinary life remains visible, but it grows increasingly constrained by forces that seldom announce themselves loudly. Those providing shelter now carry a different burden from the one they accepted months earlier. In the beginning, courage largely consisted of making a difficult decision. With time, courage becomes the patient discipline of renewing that decision every single day despite changing circumstances. They continue answering ordinary questions from neighbors while carefully guarding extraordinary secrets. They continue attending church services, managing shops, tending livestock, or repairing machinery, all while quietly calculating whether every conversation has sounded sufficiently natural. Their own lives have become divided between the visible world everyone shares and the hidden responsibility known only to a trusted few. The mother understands this transformation without needing it explained. She watches the faces of those who bring food or news, recognizing that they too have begun living inside a quieter form of confinement. The walls separating hidden families from the outside world remain physical. The walls surrounding their protectors are largely invisible, built from caution, discretion, and the constant awareness that one misplaced word could undo months or even years of careful endurance. In different ways, both households have come to inhabit the same condition. Survival now depends not upon a single courageous act, but upon the steady accumulation of thousands of ordinary decisions made correctly, quietly, and without recognition, while the pressure beyond their shared walls continues its slow and relentless growth. Pressure rarely announces itself through a single dramatic moment. More often, it gathers gradually until ordinary routines begin carrying unfamiliar weight. The woman who brings food to the hidden room now pauses longer before unlocking the concealed entrance, listening for sounds elsewhere in the house before she descends. She still smiles when she sees the children, yet her eyes often drift briefly toward the ceiling as though measuring the movement of people she cannot see. The family notices these habits without commenting upon them. Everyone has learned that some concerns become easier to bear when acknowledged through quiet understanding rather than repeated discussion. The building itself begins participating more actively in the family's awareness. Every unfamiliar vibration seems worthy of attention. Heavy boots passing along the pavement outside differ from the lighter footsteps of neighbors returning from work. The slam of a vehicle door carries differently through the walls than the ordinary clatter of carts delivering supplies. Occasionally voices gather somewhere beyond the house, lingering longer than expected before gradually fading into the distance. Most of these sounds prove entirely harmless, yet concealment changes the way ordinary noise is interpreted. Nothing can simply be ignored. Everything must first be quietly evaluated. You remain beside the mother during these long intervals of listening. She has developed an extraordinary patience that would once have seemed impossible. Minutes pass while she remains perfectly still, not from fear alone but from careful judgment. She waits until familiar rhythms return before allowing conversation to continue or movement to resume. The children imitate this discipline almost instinctively now. What was once difficult has gradually become habit, and that realization brings both comfort and sadness. They have become remarkably skilled at living a life no child should ever have been required to learn. Information arrives only in fragments, carried by those willing to accept considerable personal risk. A neighboring village has experienced house-to-house inspections. Someone known to the family has disappeared after attempting to move between safe locations. Another shelter has reportedly remained secure despite nearby searches because its occupants resisted the understandable temptation to flee too early. None of these stories can be confirmed completely. Yet each contributes to a growing understanding that conditions outside are becoming less predictable. The geography of safety is constantly shifting, forcing everyone involved to reconsider assumptions that had once provided reassurance. The helpers respond with quiet adjustments rather than visible alarm. Supplies are delivered in smaller quantities but at more frequent intervals so that shortages remain less noticeable. Conversations near entrances become even shorter than before. Children living openly within the household are gently reminded never to speak casually about rooms they are forbidden to enter. These precautions emerge not from panic but from experience. Those protecting hidden families have learned that survival often depends upon preventing curiosity from becoming memory, and memory from becoming conversation. Inside the concealed room, the mother devotes increasing attention to preserving emotional balance. She understands that prolonged vigilance can slowly reshape the mind until every unexpected sound feels equally threatening. To resist this, she quietly insists that lessons continue even after unsettling news arrives. Reading remains part of the afternoon whenever circumstances allow. Stories are still told before sleep, and birthdays or religious observances are acknowledged with the same modest rituals the family has carefully maintained throughout their confinement. These familiar practices do not deny the danger outside. They prevent danger from becoming the only reality the children are able to recognize. There are evenings when hope appears unexpectedly through the smallest observations. A bird builds its nest beneath the eaves exactly where it had the previous spring. The scent of freshly cut hay drifts faintly through a narrow opening after nearby fields are harvested. Rain taps softly against the roof before giving way to clear skies that fill the hidden room with slightly brighter daylight the following morning. Such moments possess no strategic importance. They simply remind the family that the natural world continues according to rhythms larger than occupation, persecution, or fear. That continuity quietly strengthens the resolve to endure another day. The woman sheltering them sometimes lingers for a few extra moments after delivering the evening meal, not because there is important news to share, but because silence itself has become easier to bear together than apart. She speaks softly about ordinary matters, the condition of the vegetable garden, a neighbor's cow that wandered through an open gate, the unusually early arrival of autumn frost upon the surrounding fields. These conversations are carefully chosen. Their purpose is not distraction but preservation. They maintain a bridge between the hidden room and the ordinary world, ensuring that daily life beyond the walls does not gradually become something abstract or unimaginable. As another night settles over the village, lamps are extinguished one by one, leaving only scattered points of warm light visible through distant windows. Somewhere beyond the house, people prepare for sleep, believing tomorrow will resemble today. Within the concealed room, the family prepares for rest with the same quiet discipline they have practiced for many months, aware that the coming day may demand nothing more than continued patience, or something entirely different. They cannot know which. Yet before darkness fully surrounds them, the mother gently pulls the blankets around her children and listens to their breathing settle into the steady rhythm of sleep. In that simple sound she finds a measure of peace, fragile but real, worth protecting with every careful decision that another unseen day will require. The narrowing circle. Winter returns with a patience that seems almost indifferent to the anxieties carried within the hidden room. Cold settles gradually into the beams above, the stones below, and the narrow spaces between them where the family has now lived long enough to recognize every familiar draft. The air feels sharper each morning, encouraging everyone to remain beneath blankets a little longer before beginning the day's quiet routines. Fuel must be used sparingly. Warmth is no longer something taken for granted but carefully managed, shared between bodies, blankets, and whatever modest heat can be produced without drawing attention beyond the walls. The mother notices that winter changes more than temperature. It alters sound. Bare branches no longer soften distant noises as they had during the warmer months. Footsteps carry farther across frozen ground. Wagon wheels crossing hardened roads produce a clearer echo that reaches the shelter with surprising precision. Even conversations drifting through the cold air seem to travel more distinctly before dissolving into silence. The season reshapes the hidden family's awareness, reminding them that nature itself can quietly influence the conditions of concealment. You remain with the family as the days shorten and darkness arrives before the afternoon has fully faded. Artificial light becomes increasingly precious. Candles are trimmed with extraordinary care so that every evening's flame may survive a little longer. Reading is often reserved for the brightest hours of daylight, while sewing and mending continue near the small pool of light that a single candle provides after sunset. Shadows gather quickly in the corners of the room, yet no one remarks upon them. Darkness has long since become another familiar resident of the shelter. The children experience winter differently than they once did. They remember snow not as something viewed through a narrow opening, but as something beneath their boots, something gathered into cold hands and shaped into figures that stood only until the afternoon sun returned. Those memories now compete with new habits formed entirely within confinement. One child watches snowflakes drifting past the small window for several quiet minutes before asking how deeply they have settled upon the streets outside. Another wonders whether the pond near their former home has frozen as completely as it had during earlier winters. The questions are not expressions of impatience. They are careful attempts to keep familiar landscapes alive inside memory. Food becomes more difficult to obtain as winter advances. Harvests have already been stored, transport grows increasingly complicated, and shortages affecting entire communities inevitably reach those living in hiding. The woman bringing supplies continues appearing whenever she safely can, though the basket she carries sometimes contains less than it did during autumn. Bread is sliced thinner. Soup is stretched with whatever vegetables remain available. Potatoes, onions, dried beans, and preserved foods become the dependable foundation of nearly every meal. The mother accepts each portion with gratitude while quietly adjusting expectations rather than allowing disappointment to settle over the children. The hidden room also begins revealing the physical consequences of prolonged confinement. Clothing repaired many times finally approaches the limits of what another careful stitch can accomplish. Shoes worn only indoors nevertheless continue deteriorating because time itself slowly weakens leather, thread, and fabric. Blankets become thinner despite constant mending. The family works patiently to preserve what they possess because replacing almost anything has become impossible. Objects that once seemed ordinary now remain in service far beyond the life for which they were originally made, bearing silent witness to months measured more by endurance than abundance. Outside, the occupation continues tightening its hold upon daily life in ways only partially understood within the shelter. News brought by trusted helpers speaks of additional regulations, growing suspicion, and communities increasingly shaped by caution rather than familiarity. Some neighboring families have disappeared. Others have quietly left their homes under circumstances no one fully explains. Markets remain open, churches continue holding services, and trains still arrive according to schedule. Yet beneath these visible routines, the social fabric grows steadily more strained. People continue greeting one another, but many conversations now begin with careful observation before trust is extended. Those offering protection feel this narrowing most directly. Every ordinary interaction with neighbors requires greater attentiveness than before. A casual question about household supplies, visitors, or unusual sounds inside the home may carry no hidden meaning at all. Yet it cannot simply be dismissed. The hosts learn to answer naturally without appearing rehearsed, to continue familiar routines without exaggerating them, and to preserve an outward appearance of ordinary life while quietly sustaining another entirely invisible household beneath their own. Their courage has become increasingly subtle. It now expresses itself less through decisive action than through the patient maintenance of normality under conditions where even normality has become difficult to preserve. The mother recognizes this burden each time food arrives, each time whispered news is shared, and each time the concealed entrance closes once more. She understands that the circle surrounding everyone involved has gradually narrowed. Opportunities have become fewer. Margins for error have become smaller. Yet within that narrowing space, acts of trust continue passing silently from one person to another. Bread is still divided. Lessons continue. Blankets are folded each morning. Stories are remembered before sleep. The world beyond the walls may be growing increasingly uncertain, but inside the hidden room the family answers that uncertainty in the only way still available to them: by preserving, day after day, the quiet habits that remind them they remain human despite every force attempting to reduce life to fear alone. Winter settles more deeply over the landscape until the hidden room seems wrapped inside layers of snow, timber, and silence. The family cannot always see the weather directly, yet they learn to recognize it through countless small signs. The woman bringing food stamps her boots a little longer before entering the house above. Cold air slips briefly into the shelter whenever the concealed entrance is opened, carrying with it the scent of wood smoke and frozen earth. Water stored in metal containers feels painfully cold against the hands, and blankets retain the chill of the room until warmed by patient stillness beneath them. The season is experienced not through broad views of white fields, but through the quiet conversation between the body and the air surrounding it. The mother carefully watches how winter shapes the children. Their movements become slower during the first hour after waking, and fingers linger near the stove whenever a small fire can safely be maintained. She invents gentle exercises that can be performed without creating noise, encouraging stretching, careful pacing across the limited floor, and simple games requiring thought rather than movement. These routines are offered almost playfully, yet beneath them lies practical concern. Bodies confined for many months require deliberate care if they are to remain healthy. Childhood energy cannot simply disappear. It must be guided into forms compatible with survival. You notice how remarkably attentive the children have become to details that once would have escaped them. They recognize individual birds by the brief songs drifting through the small opening near the roof. They identify the difference between rain-striking tiles and sleet brushing against wooden walls. One child confidently predicts that snow has begun to fall again simply because the sounds from the nearby road have grown softer, muffled beneath a fresh layer of white. The mother quietly smiles at these observations, appreciating how carefully her children continue listening to a world they can scarcely see. Their connection to nature has not been broken. It has simply learned to travel through different senses. Books gradually become companions rather than possessions. The family owns very few, yet each volume seems to expand every time it is reopened. Familiar stories reveal details overlooked during previous readings. Passages are recited from memory while children quietly correct one another if a sentence has been forgotten. Sometimes the mother closes the book altogether and asks them to continue the story themselves, not to invent a different ending but to preserve every remembered word. In this way, reading becomes both education and preservation. The books slowly migrate from paper into memory, where no search, confiscation, or hurried departure can remove them. The hidden room also acquires moments of unexpected laughter. They arrive cautiously, never loudly, yet sincerely enough to remind everyone that joy has not entirely surrendered its place. A child mispronounces a difficult word during lessons, prompting smiles that spread despite determined efforts to remain quiet. A knitted mitten repaired many times finally acquires such an unusual shape that everyone pauses to admire its determined refusal to fall apart. The woman sheltering them occasionally shares an amusing story about an escaped chicken or a stubborn goat whose adventures can safely be discussed because they belong to ordinary rural life rather than the dangers beyond it. These moments pass quickly, but they leave behind a warmth no fire could entirely provide. News from outside continues arriving unevenly. Some reports suggest military developments far beyond the village, places whose names have become increasingly familiar despite their great distance. Others speak only of local realities, another inspection in a neighboring district, additional restrictions, someone quietly disappearing after an anonymous accusation. The mother listens carefully but resists allowing every fragment to dominate the atmosphere inside the room. She has come to understand that uncertainty possesses an endless appetite. If permitted, it can consume every conversation until nothing remains except speculation. Instead, she gently guides attention back toward the tangible tasks of the day, believing that careful work often steadies the mind more effectively than unanswered questions. Those providing shelter have grown equally skilled at protecting emotional balance. They understand that every visit cannot carry alarming news, even when circumstances remain difficult. Sometimes they bring only fresh bread, a few preserved apples discovered at the back of a cellar, or the quiet observation that daylight is beginning to linger a little longer each evening. These simple remarks are not attempts to ignore reality. They acknowledge another truth equally deserving of attention. Beyond occupation and fear, the seasons continue advancing towards spring with remarkable fidelity. Nature has become an unspoken ally, offering evidence that change remains possible even when human affairs appear trapped within repetition. As winter slowly begins yielding to longer afternoons, the hidden family senses the transition before they can fully confirm it. The room brightens slightly during lessons. The air loses a little of its sharpness. Meltwater can sometimes be heard dripping steadily from roofs outside, replacing the brittle silence that had accompanied weeks of frost. These changes are modest, almost imperceptible from one day to the next, yet together they introduce a subtle alteration in the emotional landscape. Nothing has fundamentally improved. The dangers remain. The family is still concealed. Yet the return of light quietly interrupts the illusion that confinement exists outside the passage of time. Seasons continue turning beyond the walls, and with each gradual change they remind the mother of something she carefully protects within herself as faithfully as she protects her children: the conviction that no winter, however long, has ever persuaded the earth to abandon spring forever. Houses that no longer feel invisible. The arrival of spring does not lessen the burden carried within the hidden room. It changes it. Windows throughout the village begin opening more frequently, allowing fresh air to replace the heaviness of winter. Doors remain ajar while gardens are prepared for planting. Children who live openly once again fill lanes and fields with voices carried easily across the warming air. For those in concealment, these ordinary signs of renewal introduce an unexpected complication. Sound now travels differently. Activity increases. The world becomes louder, more visible, and therefore more difficult to hide within. The mother notices this transformation almost immediately. During the colder months, much of life beyond the walls had retreated indoors, wrapped in the same weather that confined everyone else. Spring draws people outward again. Workers repair fences damaged by winter storms. Farmers prepare equipment stored for months beneath rough wooden roofs. Laundry hangs between houses where neighbors pause for conversation. Visitors arrive without warning simply because the roads have become easier to travel. None of these ordinary activities threatens the hidden family by itself. Together, they gradually reduce the quiet margins upon which concealment has depended. You remain within the shelter long enough to recognize how environmental change quietly reshapes emotional life. The same footsteps crossing the yard now occur more often than before. Conversations drift through open windows with remarkable clarity. Wagons arrive carrying tools, seed, or supplies for the coming season, lingering just long enough to interrupt the careful certainty that routine had once provided. The hidden family does not respond with panic. Instead, everyone begins listening more carefully than they already had, adjusting habits that only recently had begun to feel settled. Those providing shelter experience an even more demanding season. Spring invites social life back into villages that had seemed almost withdrawn during winter. Neighbors borrow equipment, exchange seeds, discuss planting schedules, and offer unexpected visits that would have appeared entirely natural in any previous year. Refusing such interactions, too, often risks attracting attention. Accepting them requires maintaining complete composure while another family remains concealed only a short distance away. Hospitality itself becomes another quiet discipline, requiring ordinary conversation to continue naturally while extraordinary responsibility remains hidden behind walls known only to a trusted few. The mother observes these subtle tensions without needing them explained. The woman bringing food occasionally apologizes for arriving later than expected because someone remained unexpectedly in the kitchen. A planned visit must sometimes be postponed until evening because workers spent the afternoon repairing a nearby fence. Deliveries become smaller again, not because generosity has diminished, but because carrying large quantities across an increasingly active household invites unnecessary curiosity. Practical adjustments continue accumulating, each one modest enough to seem insignificant, yet together they steadily reshape the family's daily rhythm. Children perceive these changes differently. They notice that quiet hours have become longer and opportunities for whispered conversation fewer. They ask why they cannot approach the small window as often as before, or why certain parts of the day now require complete stillness regardless of how carefully they move. Their mother answers with the same patient honesty she has practiced throughout concealment. The world outside has become busier, she explains gently. More people are nearby. More ears are listening without realizing it. Nothing more needs to be said. The children have lived within these conditions long enough to understand what such explanations quietly contain. Beyond the village, the wider machinery of occupation continues tightening its reach. Regulations expand into places that had once escaped closer scrutiny. Transportation routes are watched more carefully. Identity papers acquire greater significance. Entire communities grow increasingly accustomed to inspections that would once have seemed extraordinary. Those hidden inside attics, barns, workshops, and concealed rooms rarely witness these developments directly. Instead, They experience them through their consequences. Safe routes disappear. Messages take longer to arrive. Familiar names are mentioned less frequently because speaking them has become painful or uncertain. The hidden room itself remains physically unchanged, yet it no longer feels quite as secure as it once had. Not because its walls have weakened, but because confidence has. Months of successful concealment had gradually allowed everyone to settle into disciplined routine. Now that routine must once again adapt to changing circumstances. Familiar habits are quietly reconsidered. Times for movement shift. Lessons are rearranged around different periods of silence. Even the simple act of lifting the blanket covering the window becomes rarer, reserved for moments when careful listening suggests the outside world has briefly withdrawn again. The mother accepts these adjustments without complaint, though they carry a quiet emotional cost. Each new precaution reminds her that survival can never be treated as an achievement already secured. It must be renewed every morning through fresh acts of patience, fresh attention, and fresh trust in people whose own burdens continue growing heavier. Spring has returned to the fields beyond the walls, filling orchards with blossoms and villages with movement. Inside the shelter, another season has arrived as well, not one of renewal, but of increasing vigilance, where ordinary life outside grows steadily fuller while the hidden family's world becomes, almost imperceptibly, even smaller. The changes do not arrive all at once. They reveal themselves through interruptions. One afternoon, while the children quietly copy passages from a worn exercise book, voices linger outside the house longer than expected. They are not raised in anger. They belong to neighbors discussing repairs needed before the summer harvest, pausing occasionally to examine a fence that runs close to the building. Their conversation drifts easily through the open air, sometimes fading, sometimes returning as they move around the property. For nearly an hour, no one inside the hidden room dares move more than necessary. When the voices finally disappear, the silence that follows feels strangely unfamiliar, as though the room itself must remember how to breathe again. The mother notices that these interruptions are becoming part of the day's rhythm. A merchant arrives unexpectedly with supplies. Someone borrows tools. A traveling official asks for directions before continuing toward another village. None of these visitors comes searching for the hidden family. Yet concealment has never depended only upon avoiding deliberate searches. It depends equally upon surviving countless ordinary moments when innocent curiosity might accidentally wander too close to carefully protected secrets. You remain with the family through these extended intervals of waiting. They are among the least visible yet most demanding aspects of life in hiding. Hours may pass during which nothing happens except listening. A chair remains untouched because moving it might produce unnecessary sound. A child postpones asking a question until footsteps have faded. Meals grow cold before they can safely be eaten. Time itself seems to stretch, not because events have become dramatic, but because attention has become so complete that every passing minute carries unusual weight. Those providing shelter begin making decisions whose emotional burden remains largely invisible to the people they protect. Invitations from neighbors are accepted or declined with careful thought. Repairs to the house are delayed if unfamiliar workers would need access to sensitive areas. Family celebrations become smaller than tradition would normally allow. Even routine acts of generosity toward friends must occasionally be restrained, for too many visitors crossing the threshold gradually increase the possibility that someone might notice a detail that does not quite fit ordinary expectations. These sacrifices rarely appear in official accounts of occupation. They leave almost no written record. Yet they quietly reshape entire households. The family living openly continues paying taxes, tending gardens, attending church, and exchanging greetings with neighbors. Outwardly, Their lives appear reassuringly familiar. Beneath that ordinary surface, every decision is measured against a second question that remains forever unspoken. Will this place another family at greater risk? The hidden room has become part of the moral architecture of the house itself, influencing choices made in rooms where the concealed family never sets foot. The mother feels this dependence with increasing intensity. Gratitude, once simple in its sincerity, gradually acquires greater complexity. She sees how the months have altered those protecting them. The farmer's shoulders seem a little more stooped after another season of difficult work. The woman who prepares their meals occasionally pauses before climbing back upstairs, gathering strength for responsibilities waiting beyond the concealed door. Even the children of the household, though never fully informed, have quietly adapted their behavior, learning which questions are better left unasked and which corners of the home are never entered without permission. There are evenings when the hidden family wonders about people no longer mentioned in whispered updates. Earlier in their confinement, names of relatives and friends appeared regularly in conversation, accompanied by cautious optimism or anxious speculation. Now certain names simply disappear. No announcement explains their absence. No conclusion is offered. Silence slowly occupies the spaces where familiar lives had once been discussed, and everyone understands that not every silence carries the same meaning. Some reflect uncertainty. Others protect hope. Still others conceal grief that has not yet found words gentle enough to be spoken before children. The mother sometimes waits until the children are asleep before allowing herself to dwell upon these absences. She remembers family gatherings that had once seemed entirely ordinary, tables crowded with conversation, grandparents gently correcting old stories, cousins racing through gardens while adults called after them with affectionate patience. Those memories remain vivid, yet they have begun acquiring the soft distance usually reserved for much earlier decades. The war has not merely separated people across geography. It has altered the way memory itself is experienced, making even recent happiness feel as though it belongs to another lifetime. Outside, the village continues preparing for summer. Gardens deepen into shades of green. Birds feed their young beneath the eaves. Market days once again draw small gatherings whose conversations mingle with the sounds of wagons and footsteps upon familiar streets. Nature and community continue producing the appearance of ordinary continuity. Inside the concealed room, another form of continuity persists with equal determination. Blankets are folded. Lessons resume after every interruption. Bread is divided with the same careful fairness. Stories continue at bedtime, even when the mother herself grows increasingly uncertain about what tomorrow may require. It is during these quiet repetitions that a different kind of courage begins to emerge. It no longer resembles the courage required to flee home or to open a door to strangers in need. Instead, it becomes the courage to continue trusting routines that can never guarantee safety, to preserve tenderness when suspicion surrounds the wider world, and to wake each morning willing to repeat yesterday's discipline without knowing whether tomorrow will finally ask something far more difficult of everyone who has quietly shared this fragile sanctuary. News that arrives without certainty. Summer settles gently across the countryside, bringing longer days that seem almost endless to those living openly and strangely compressed to those who remain hidden. Sunlight reaches the concealed room earlier each morning, slipping through narrow gaps before gradually withdrawing toward evening. The warmth softens the chill that had lingered through winter, yet it also encourages greater activity beyond the walls. Fields demand constant attention. Roads fill with bicycles, carts, and pedestrians. Windows remain open for fresh air, allowing ordinary village life to travel freely through the building in the form of voices, laughter, tools striking wood, and distant church bells carried upon the still air. For the hidden family, the outside world becomes more audible than visible. They begin recognizing particular neighbors not by sight, but by the rhythm of their work. Someone sharpens farming tools every Tuesday morning with deliberate, patient strokes. Another whistles quietly while tending a nearby garden. Children pass beneath the window at nearly the same hour each afternoon during the school holidays, their conversations drifting upward before disappearing around the next corner. These familiar sounds create the curious impression of belonging to a community from which the family has become almost entirely absent. The mother listens carefully to these ordinary rhythms because they provide reassurance that life beyond concealment continues following recognizable patterns. Predictability itself has become comforting. Yet alongside these familiar sounds arrive others that carry no such certainty. A vehicle stops outside the house at an unusual hour. Unfamiliar voices exchange brief, formal greetings before entering a neighboring building. Somewhere farther along the road, raised conversation briefly interrupts the calm before fading into silence. None of these moments necessarily signals danger. Their uncertainty is precisely what makes them difficult to carry. You remain with the family as information continues arriving only in fragments. Those providing shelter rarely possess complete knowledge of events unfolding beyond the immediate community. News passes from village to village through conversations, letters, travelers, railway workers, clergy, and countless other ordinary people who unknowingly become part of a vast network carrying incomplete truths across occupied Europe. By the time a report reaches the hidden room, it has often traveled through many careful voices, each preserving what seemed most important while inevitably leaving something behind. Some reports bring cautious encouragement. There are whispers that military fortunes have shifted in distant regions. Others speak of increased resistance activity, though details remain uncertain. Still others describe harsher measures imposed elsewhere, reminding everyone that improvement in one place does not guarantee safety in another. The mother receives each account with measured attention, refusing to allow hope or fear to outrun the evidence available. She has learned that emotional steadiness serves the children better than dramatic swings between optimism and despair. The children experience news differently. They search each new report for answers to simpler questions. Will they soon return home? Will they see grandparents again? Has the war begun ending? Their mother answers with remarkable honesty while protecting them from burdens certainty cannot yet support. She explains that many things are changing beyond the walls, but change does not always travel quickly. Sometimes it arrives unevenly, touching one town while another continues waiting. Patience, she gently reminds them, remains part of their work as surely as silence. Those protecting the family quietly carry a different relationship with uncertainty. They must transform incomplete information into practical decisions. Should supplies continue following the same route? Is it safer to postpone deliveries for several days after increased official activity nearby? Does a rumor justify changing habits established over many months, or would unnecessary changes themselves attract attention? Experience teaches them that reacting to every report creates its own dangers. Calm judgment becomes as valuable as courage. The hidden room therefore remains governed less by distant headlines than by immediate realities. Water still needs carrying. Clothing still requires mending. Lessons continue because childhood cannot simply be postponed until peace returns. The mother deliberately preserves these routines, understanding that they offer something increasingly precious, a stable center around which uncertainty may circulate without entirely overwhelming the family's emotional life. Outside, orchards begin producing fruit whose scent occasionally drifts through open windows before reaching the concealed room in faint traces. Wheat fields move gently beneath warm winds that know nothing of occupation or persecution. Swallows sweep low across evening skies, returning each year to nests rebuilt beneath familiar roofs. Nature continues honoring rhythms established long before the war, quietly reminding anyone patient enough to notice that continuity remains possible even amid profound disruption. Yet within that same continuity, another awareness gradually deepens. The mother begins sensing that the war outside is changing its shape. Not because she witnesses battlefields or reads official communiques, but because uncertainty itself has become different. Earlier months had been dominated by questions of immediate survival. Now the questions slowly expand beyond tomorrow. What kind of world will remain when concealment is no longer necessary? Which familiar faces will still be waiting? What parts of ordinary life can truly be recovered after so many months, and for some families, years, spent learning how not to be seen? The reports continue arriving with the irregular rhythm of weather crossing distant hills. Some days bring no word at all, allowing the family to settle more completely into the familiar cadence of hidden life. Then, without warning, several fragments of news arrive together, each carried by a different traveler, each describing the same larger world from another angle. None can be accepted as complete truth. Together they form something resembling a horizon, never fully visible, yet impossible to ignore. The woman sheltering the family has learned to separate information into quiet categories within her own mind. There is news that requires immediate practical adjustment. There is news that should be shared because it offers perspective, even if it changes nothing inside the hidden room. Then there is news too uncertain to carry further, for repeated speculation can exhaust the spirit as thoroughly as genuine hardship. This careful discipline protects not only the concealed family but also herself. Hope, she has discovered, must be tended with as much care as fear, for both can become overwhelming if left without measure. You observe how the mother receives these conversations. She rarely interrupts. Instead, she listens until every detail has been spoken, sometimes asking only a single quiet question before allowing silence to settle once more. She has grown accustomed to incomplete knowledge. The habit would once have seemed unbearable. Now it has become another form of endurance. She no longer expects certainty before continuing the day's work. She has learned that waiting for complete understanding would leave nothing else accomplished. The children notice subtle changes in the adults long before they understand their cause. They see an exchanged glance when unfamiliar names are mentioned. They recognize that certain conversations continue only after they have returned to their books or settled beneath their blankets for the evening. Yet they also notice something encouraging. During recent weeks, the woman bringing supplies has occasionally allowed herself a gentler smile than before. Once or twice she has spoken about the future without immediately correcting herself, mentioning gardens that will need tending next year or repairs the house might someday receive after peace has returned. These remarks are modest, almost accidental, yet they carry unusual warmth. The hidden room responds to these small changes with remarkable caution. No one begins making plans aloud. No bags are packed. No one speaks confidently about departure. Experience has taught every adult present that premature certainty can wound more deeply than continued patience. Instead, life proceeds according to the same careful structure that has preserved them for so long. Lessons continue. Clothing is repaired. Bread is divided. The children read familiar stories whose endings remain unchanged even while the future beyond the walls slowly shifts beneath unseen forces. Outside, summer gradually approaches its fullest expression. Bees move patiently between flowering plants, indifferent to uniforms passing along distant roads. Hay dries in broad fields before being gathered into neat stacks that alter the appearance of the countryside almost overnight. Rivers continue reflecting morning light with quiet constancy, while evenings lengthen into soft hours filled with birdsong that drifts through open windows before darkness slowly settles across the land. The family experiences these changes almost entirely through sound, scent, and imagination. Yet they remain connected to the seasons in ways confinement has never entirely severed. The mother often finds herself studying her children's faces while they sleep. They appear older now than when concealment first began. Their features have quietly matured beneath the same roof beams that have sheltered them through changing seasons. One child no longer curls quite so tightly beneath the blankets. Another has begun speaking with a steadier voice during the day's lessons. These transformations fill her with conflicting emotions. Growth is evidence that life has continued despite everything surrounding them. Yet each sign of maturity also reminds her how much of childhood has unfolded inside a space never intended to contain it. Those offering protection notice similar changes within themselves. They have become accustomed to living with divided awareness, conducting ordinary conversations while carrying extraordinary knowledge that cannot be shared. The effort no longer demands constant concentration as it once did. Instead, it has settled into character itself. They instinctively glance toward windows before discussing certain matters. They unconsciously count footsteps crossing the hallway above the concealed entrance. Their children, though still shielded from the full truth, have matured as well, learning that kindness sometimes requires quiet obedience rather than complete understanding. As another evening draws gently to a close, the hidden room grows still once again. A candle burns with a smaller flame than usual, carefully preserved for nights still to come. The last pages of a familiar book are quietly read before it is placed back upon its shelf. Outside, the sounds of the village gradually soften until only the distant call of a night bird and the occasional stirring of leaves remain. Within that calm, the family prepares for sleep as they have done through so many evenings before. They possess no certainty about tomorrow, only the habits that have carried them faithfully across yesterday. Yet somewhere beneath those familiar routines, almost too quiet to name, another feeling has begun taking shape. Not confidence, not relief, but the cautious awareness that history itself may be changing beyond the reach of their hidden room, even if its consequences have not yet arrived at their door. The burden of waiting for the unknown. There is a particular kind of waiting that emerges only after long endurance. It no longer resembles the anxious anticipation of the early months, when every unfamiliar sound seemed capable of deciding the family's fate before nightfall. Instead, it becomes quieter and more complex. The immediate routines of concealment remain unchanged, yet somewhere beyond the walls events continue unfolding with increasing speed, while those living in hiding can influence almost none of them. The hidden room remains still even as history itself gathers momentum elsewhere. The mother senses this widening distance between the visible and the unseen. News now arrives speaking less about individual regulations and more about movements across entire regions. Railways carry unusual traffic. Roads once busy with ordinary commerce now witness columns of military vehicles passing at irregular hours. Travelers describe communities preparing for possibilities no one fully understands. These reports are cautious, incomplete, and sometimes contradictory, yet they all share one characteristic. They suggest that the world outside is no longer standing still. Inside the shelter, however, another morning begins exactly as the previous one ended. Blankets are folded with practiced care before being stacked against the wall to create more space within the room. Water is divided according to familiar needs. Breakfast, modest though it is, follows the same quiet ritual that has sustained the family for so many months. Lessons begin once daylight has strengthened enough to read without wasting precious candlelight. The children recite passages they now know almost by heart, occasionally pausing to help one another remember a forgotten sentence. The room continues its patient rhythm, seemingly untouched by distant developments. You observe how carefully the mother protects this rhythm. She understands that uncertainty becomes most dangerous when it begins interrupting ordinary discipline. If every rumor altered the day's structure, the family would soon possess nothing stable enough upon which to rest their minds. Routine, therefore, becomes an act of quiet leadership. Not because it denies the importance of events beyond the walls, but because it reminds everyone that survival still depends upon the next careful rather than the next hopeful report. The children continue asking thoughtful questions, though they have changed in character since the first months of hiding. They no longer ask only when they will leave. They have begun wondering what leaving itself might feel like. Will the streets look the same? Will their friends recognize them? Will school still exist as they remember it? The youngest asks whether birds continue building nests in the old garden each spring. The eldest wonders whether the family photographs left behind are still resting safely inside their drawer. Their questions reveal minds quietly reaching toward a future they can scarcely imagine, attempting to reconnect memory with possibility. Those sheltering the family experience their own form of waiting. They rise each morning prepared to continue exactly as before, while privately acknowledging that circumstances beyond their control may soon demand entirely different decisions. They inspect doors and windows with habitual attention, tend gardens, feed livestock, greet neighbors, and perform all the ordinary work expected of them. Yet every evening they also pause to consider whether tomorrow's routines should remain unchanged or whether the changing conditions beyond the village require another careful adjustment. Their lives have become exercises in measured judgment, balancing caution against unnecessary fear. The emotional burden carried by both households now reveals itself less through visible anxiety than through quiet fatigue. Long vigilance leaves few dramatic scars. Instead, it gradually settles into posture, expression, and habit. The woman bringing supplies occasionally rests her hand against the kitchen table before beginning the climb back upstairs, taking only a brief moment to gather herself before returning to the visible world. The mother notices these pauses and silently understands them. Both women have spent many months carrying responsibilities that cannot be shared openly with neighbors, friends, or even many members of their own extended families. Outside, late summer begins yielding almost imperceptibly to early autumn. Fields that only recently shimmered with growing grain now stand neatly harvested beneath broad skies. Swallows gather in greater numbers before beginning their long journey southward, following instincts older than nations themselves. Even the evening light changes, arriving with a softer golden hue before fading earlier each day. The family watches these transformations through the smallest glimpses available, aware that another cycle of seasons is quietly completing itself. Time has continued its faithful work despite concealment, reminding them that endurance is measured not only in fear survived, but also in ordinary days patiently lived while waiting for a future that still refuses to reveal itself. As autumn gradually settles across the countryside, the hidden room acquires a quieter mood than before. The changing season brings no immediate alteration to the family's circumstances, yet everyone senses that another cycle has nearly completed itself. Leaves begin falling from trees whose branches the children know almost entirely through memory. Rain returns with greater regularity, tapping gently against roofs and windows before disappearing into the earth beyond their sight. The air carries the unmistakable scent of damp soil and harvested fields whenever the concealed entrance is briefly opened. Even without stepping outside, the family remains connected to the landscape through these patient signals. The mother increasingly notices how differently each child responds to prolonged waiting. One has become remarkably thoughtful, lingering over books long after lessons have ended, asking questions whose answers extend far beyond the pages before them. Another remains more immediately curious, searching every small glimpse of the outside world for evidence that ordinary life continues somewhere beyond the walls. Neither response troubles her. Childhood, she has come to understand, protects itself in many different ways. Some children build inward worlds rich enough to sustain long confinement. Others preserve hope by keeping their attention gently fixed upon the horizon they cannot yet reach. You remain beside the family during evenings that have grown slightly longer with the shortening days. Candlelight once again becomes more necessary, and its soft glow gathers everyone into closer circles than summer required. Stories return to an important place within the household's rhythm. Some are drawn from sacred tradition, others from family memory, and many from simple recollections of ordinary days before concealment began. The mother describes marketplaces filled with autumn produce, walks through forests where fallen leaves softened every footstep, and family meals that seemed entirely unremarkable when they were first lived. The children listen with quiet concentration, gradually recognizing that these memories preserve more than nostalgia. They preserve belonging. Those providing shelter also find themselves remembering earlier years with unusual frequency. The farmer recalls harvests completed without fear that strangers might unexpectedly arrive asking difficult questions. His wife remembers welcoming neighbors freely through the front door without first considering which conversations needed careful restraint. These reflections are not expressions of regret alone. They quietly reaffirm what everyone involved hopes may one day return, not merely safety, but the uncomplicated trust that once allowed ordinary communities to breathe without constant caution. News continues arriving, though it now carries a subtly different tone. Reports speak of advancing armies in distant regions, shifting front lines, and growing uncertainty among occupying authorities themselves. None of these developments immediately changes life inside the concealed room. The mother refuses to let distant military movements become promises they cannot yet fulfill. She has seen too many months pass between hopeful rumors and lived reality. Instead, she accepts each report as another small piece of a vast landscape still hidden beyond the limits of direct experience. Yet hope itself begins changing. Earlier in the family's confinement, hope often felt like something fragile, easily disturbed by every disappointing rumor or delayed message. Now it becomes quieter and somehow steadier. It no longer depends entirely upon the next report or the next whispered conversation. It grows instead from the remarkable realization that they have endured far longer than anyone once believed possible. Every carefully completed day now carries its own quiet evidence that tomorrow, however uncertain, may also be survived. The children unknowingly contribute to this transformation. Their continued curiosity, their willingness to learn, and their ability to discover moments of happiness inside extraordinary limitations remind the adults that the future remains worthy of protection. A lesson completed with unusual enthusiasm. A drawing carefully made upon the back of an old envelope. A whispered joke shared before bedtime. These moments possess no historical significance in themselves. Yet they quietly resist the larger purpose of persecution, which seeks not only to threaten life but also to diminish the ordinary human capacities for affection, imagination, and joy. Outside, the first stronger winds of autumn move steadily across the countryside. They strip leaves from branches that had only weeks before seemed full of summer's abundance. Fields gradually empty after harvest, leaving wide open spaces where stubble catches the pale afternoon light. Migrating birds disappear toward warmer skies, continuing journeys that generations before them had followed without interruption from human conflict. The landscape begins preparing for another winter with calm acceptance, reminding anyone patient enough to observe it that change rarely arrives through sudden transformation. More often, it unfolds through countless quiet transitions that become visible only after enough time has passed. As darkness settles once again over the hidden room, The family prepares for another night whose outline closely resembles those that came before. Blankets are arranged, prayers quietly spoken, and the final candle carefully extinguished. Yet beneath this familiar routine lies a subtle alteration almost impossible to name. Waiting itself has changed. It no longer feels entirely suspended between past and future. Somewhere beyond the walls, history is beginning to move toward an ending no one inside the shelter can yet see. The family cannot hasten its arrival, nor can they know what losses or discoveries it will bring. All they can do is continue preserving the small, faithful routines that have carried them this far, trusting that when the world finally reaches their hidden door, they will still recognize themselves as the family they worked so patiently to remain. When the silence begins to change. The first signs do not resemble liberation. They resemble confusion. The hidden room has become so accustomed to interpreting every unfamiliar sound as potential danger that even hopeful changes are received with caution rather than celebration. One morning, distant engines pass along the road in greater numbers than usual. They travel steadily for several hours before gradually fading. The following day, the road is strangely quiet. Then voices return, though they carry a different quality than before, less measured, more uncertain, as if everyone outside is trying to understand events unfolding beyond the limits of immediate sight. The mother resists drawing conclusions. She has learned that war rarely changes cleanly from one day to the next. Armies move unevenly. Authority weakens in one district while remaining firmly established in another. Rumors often outrun reality by many days or even weeks. Inside the shelter, the safest response remains the same one that has protected the family throughout their concealment: patience. You remain inside the room with them as waiting acquires an entirely different character. It is no longer the waiting of endless repetition. It becomes the waiting that follows movement just beyond the horizon, when something profound appears to be approaching but has not yet reached those still hidden. The routines continue unchanged, yet every unexpected sound now invites careful listening rather than quiet resignation. Those providing shelter become noticeably more cautious, though not more fearful. They speak in lower voices than before, not because danger has certainly increased, but because uncertainty has become unusually complex. Travelers passing through nearby villages carry contradictory reports. One insists that occupying forces have withdrawn from neighboring towns. Another claims fighting has intensified farther along the main roads. A railway worker describes trains no longer following their ordinary schedules. A farmer returning from market speaks of unfamiliar uniforms seen only briefly before continuing westward. No single report is trusted completely. Together, they suggest that the world outside is beginning to rearrange itself. The children notice the adults listening more frequently at the concealed entrance before beginning conversations. They see maps unfolded once again upon the kitchen table upstairs during the brief moments when the hidden family is invited to receive fresh air inside the larger house after nightfall. The maps had not disappeared entirely during previous months, yet now they remain open longer, fingers tracing roads whose importance had once seemed purely geographical but now appear connected to decisions that may soon affect every household in the district. The mother quietly continues the day's lessons. Reading, writing, arithmetic. The children accept these familiar routines without protest, though their attention drifts more often towards sounds arriving from outside. Even they recognize that something has changed, despite possessing no clear understanding of what that change may become. The mother allows herself a small smile when the youngest struggles to concentrate upon a page because distant church bells have begun ringing at an unusual hour. Curiosity, she thinks, is finally beginning to compete with confinement. The helpers themselves face increasingly difficult judgments. If liberation truly approaches, Should the family remain hidden until complete certainty exists? Or does waiting too long create new dangers of its own? The answer remains painfully unclear. A premature departure could still prove catastrophic. An unnecessary delay might expose the family to different risks created by rapidly changing military conditions. For the first time in many months, concealment itself is no longer the only strategy demanding careful consideration. Outside, nature continues with remarkable indifference to human uncertainty. Early spring rain darkens the fields before giving way to pale sunlight that glitters upon fresh leaves unfolding across hedgerows. Streams swollen by melting snow move steadily toward larger rivers, carrying twigs, fallen blossoms, and fragments of winter downstream without hesitation. Birds rebuild nests damaged by storms, returning to the same branches they had occupied the year before, guided by instincts untouched by governments or front lines. The mother watches one small bird through the narrow opening near the window. It lands upon a branch scarcely visible beyond the roofline. For several moments it gathers dry grass before disappearing again. When it returns, it carries another fragment. Then another. Patiently, without knowing whether the coming season will be gentle or harsh. She realizes, almost with surprise, that the work of rebuilding always begins before certainty has fully arrived. Yet she says nothing. The children return to their books. The room settles once more into quiet concentration. Beyond its walls, history continues moving closer with every passing day. But inside, the family preserves the discipline that has carried them safely across so many months. They understand, perhaps better than anyone outside, that the most dangerous moment in a long period of concealment is not always its beginning. Sometimes it is the moment when the silence itself begins to change. The days that follow refuse to settle into a single pattern. One morning begins with unusual quiet, so complete that the family wonders whether rain has discouraged movement throughout the village. The next carries the distant rumble of heavy vehicles traveling for hours before disappearing beyond the horizon. On another afternoon, church bells ring without any feast day the mother can remember, their echoes lingering over the fields before fading into a silence that feels somehow expectant rather than empty. Each sound seems to belong to a larger story unfolding beyond the limits of the hidden room, yet none reveals enough for certainty to take root. The woman sheltering the family becomes increasingly deliberate in the information she shares. She has learned that changing circumstances demand greater precision, not greater excitement. One evening she quietly explains that several familiar officials have not been seen in the village for days. Another night she mentions that travelers describe roads filled with people moving in both directions, some returning home while others continue searching for relatives whose whereabouts remain unknown. She offers these observations without interpretation, allowing facts to stand on their own. Hope, she believes, should grow from reality rather than outrun it. You remain with the family as patience undergoes its final transformation. Earlier in their concealment, patience meant enduring repetition without knowing whether change would ever come. Now it means resisting the temptation to mistake possibility for arrival. The emotional discipline required is different, though no less demanding. Every instinct encourages looking toward the future. Every lesson learned over the past months reminds them that survival still depends upon remaining fully present within the current day. The children begin noticing details they had once overlooked. They remark that birds seem louder in the mornings. They count the wagons passing along the road, surprised that there are fewer than before. During one brief opportunity to lift the covering from the small window, they see smoke rising from more chimneys than usual, suggesting families who had remained absent may slowly be returning to their homes. These observations carry no certainty, yet they awaken quiet imagination. The outside world, long experienced only as a place of danger, begins revealing hints of ordinary life reassembling itself piece by careful piece. The mother receives these small signs with restrained gratitude. She knows that even if the occupation is weakening, the world awaiting them cannot simply resume where it once paused. Homes may stand empty. Friends may have disappeared. Entire neighborhoods may have been altered by years of absence, fear, and loss. She does not speak these thoughts aloud. The children deserve to approach the future before they are asked to understand its full weight. There will be time enough for difficult discoveries when concealment no longer governs every hour. Those who have offered shelter now face a different kind of moral burden. For many months their task was singular: keep another family alive without being discovered. Now new questions quietly emerge. When is it truly safe to open the concealed door for longer than a few moments? How should the hidden family be reintroduced into a community that may itself still be uncertain? Who among the neighbors can already be trusted with the truth, and who must remain unaware until conditions become clearer? Liberation, they begin to understand, is not merely the disappearance of danger. It is the careful navigation of everything that follows. One evening, after listening for several long minutes, the woman invites the mother and children into the larger house after darkness has fully settled. It is only for a short while, and every movement remains cautious, but the change feels extraordinary. The kitchen appears larger than memory had preserved it. The ceiling seems unexpectedly high. The children stand silently, almost reluctant to cross the room, as though open space itself has become unfamiliar. The youngest reaches toward the window but stops before touching the glass, instinctively seeking permission for an action that would once have required no thought at all. You watch without interruption as they simply stand together. No one rushes to speak. The mother rests her hand upon the back of an ordinary wooden chair, feeling its polished surface beneath her fingertips. She inhales the scent of bread cooling upon the table, mixed with wood smoke drifting gently from the stove. These sensations are profoundly ordinary, yet after so many months they possess the quiet power of rediscovery. Nothing remarkable has occurred. No speeches have been given. No formal announcement has declared the end of their concealment. And yet, within these simple moments, the boundaries of their world have expanded farther than they have in many seasons. Before returning to the hidden room for the night, the mother pauses beside the doorway leading back toward concealment. She looks once across the modest kitchen where so much courage has quietly lived without recognition. She thinks of every loaf divided, every whispered conversation, every careful footstep upon the stairs, every ordinary meal prepared while extraordinary responsibility rested invisibly beneath the floor. The room bears no monument to those months. It carries only the familiar appearance of an ordinary household. Perhaps that is fitting. The greatest acts of protection often woven so completely into daily life that, once danger passes, they leave behind almost nothing except the lives they quietly preserved. The concealed entrance closes once more behind the family. It is not the final closing, though none of them yet knows exactly how many remain. What has changed is subtler than certainty. For the first time since disappearing from the world, the hidden room no longer feels like the only future they can imagine. Somewhere beyond its walls, patiently and unevenly, ordinary life has begun finding its way back. Stepping into a changed morning. The morning arrives without ceremony. No trumpet announces it. No official proclamation reaches the hidden room before dawn. Instead, the day begins as so many others have begun, with careful listening. The mother wakes before the children, remaining perfectly still beneath her blanket while the house above slowly stirs. She recognizes the familiar sounds almost immediately. A door opening, water poured into a basin, someone placing kindling inside the stove. Yet something else accompanies those ordinary noises. There is an absence she has learned to notice as carefully as any sound. No heavy vehicles pass along the nearby road. No unfamiliar commands echo through the village. The silence beyond the house feels different, not empty, but released from a tension that had quietly accompanied every morning for so long that its disappearance is almost difficult to identify. The woman who has sheltered them descends later than usual. She does not hurry. Her movements possess an unfamiliar steadiness, as though she has spent the night weighing difficult decisions and has finally reached one that cannot be delayed much longer. She carries bread, warm enough that a faint ribbon of steam still rises from its crust, and for a few moments she simply sits beside the family without speaking. There is no dramatic announcement waiting upon her lips. Only quiet certainty. She explains gently that people have begun returning openly to the village streets. The uniforms that had once defined everyday life are no longer seen here. Neighbors have started speaking to one another in voices no longer lowered by instinct alone. No one can promise that every danger has vanished. There are still uncertainties farther along the roads, and many questions remain unanswered. But the condition that required this room has, at last, begun to pass. No one moves immediately. The children look first toward their mother rather than toward the concealed doorway. For many months they have been taught that caution is love. That patience is safety. That remaining unseen is how tomorrow becomes possible. Those lessons cannot simply be laid aside because a single morning feels different. You remain quietly beside them as they absorb the meaning without attempting to rush it. The room appears exactly as it did yesterday. Blankets remain neatly folded against the wall. The small table still carries worn books whose pages have been turned so many times that their edges have softened beneath careful hands. A repaired cup waits beside the basin, and children's drawings continue brightening rough timber with simple scenes of trees, birds, rivers, and houses remembered more vividly than recently seen. Nothing within the shelter suggests that one chapter of life is ending. Only the people have changed. The mother slowly walks around the room before preparing to leave it, touching familiar objects almost unconsciously. Her fingers rest briefly upon the blanket that kept her children warm through winter. She closes the cover of the arithmetic notebook used so faithfully throughout their lessons. She carefully folds a piece of cloth that had served as both towel and curtain, depending upon the day's needs. These gestures are not acts of reluctance. They are acknowledgments. This room asked much of them. It demanded silence from children who longed to laugh, patience from adults who longed to act, hope from people given remarkably little evidence that hope would be rewarded. For all its confinement, it also became the place where birthdays were quietly remembered, illnesses carefully tended, prayers whispered, stories preserved, fears shared without shame, and childhood protected as completely as circumstances allowed. Leaving it cannot simply be another practical task. It deserves gratitude. The children gather the few possessions that truly belong to them. There are surprisingly few. Clothing carefully repaired over many months. Books that have become almost as familiar as family members. A scarf knitted before concealment began. Drawings folded neatly between worn pages so they will not be damaged during the journey ahead. They carry these things with quiet seriousness, aware that each object has accompanied them through a chapter of life unlike anything they had once imagined. Outside, early sunlight spreads gently across the village. The orchard has entered full bloom. White blossoms move softly beneath a mild breeze while bees pass patiently from flower to flower, continuing work interrupted by no army and governed by no occupation. Rain from the previous evening still clings to fresh grass, catching the light in countless tiny reflections before slowly disappearing into the warming earth. Smoke rises from chimneys with an ease that feels almost unfamiliar, no longer asking whether it may safely be seen. The concealed doorway stands open. No one crosses it yet. The family remains together for one final moment inside the room that erased them from the world so that the world would one day have the chance to receive them again. The first step into the larger house feels more uncertain than anyone had imagined. The children do not run toward the kitchen or hurry to the windows. Instead, they move carefully, pausing after only a few steps as though expecting someone to remind them to return to silence. Months of practiced caution do not disappear simply because the concealed door has remained open. The habits that preserved life have settled deeply into the body. They reveal themselves in every hesitant movement, every glance seeking reassurance before crossing another room. The mother follows a short distance behind them, allowing each child to discover the space at their own pace. Sunlight pours through the kitchen windows with a brightness that almost seems excessive after so long beneath dim light. Dust turns gently within broad shafts of morning sun, and the scent of fresh bread mingles with damp earth drifting through the open doorway. These sensations had once belonged to ordinary mornings. Now they possess the quiet intensity of forgotten music suddenly remembered after many silent years. You remain nearby without interrupting these first moments of return. The youngest child walks toward the window and finally places a hand upon the glass. Beyond it lies nothing extraordinary, a narrow lane, a vegetable garden beginning to flourish, and a clothesline where freshly washed linen moves gently in the breeze. Yet the child studies the simple scene with complete concentration, absorbing its openness rather than its details. Freedom first appears not through dramatic landscapes, but through distance itself. The eye is no longer forced to stop at four familiar walls. The older child hesitates beside the doorway leading into the yard. The threshold seems strangely unfamiliar. Crossing it would mean standing beneath open sky for the first time in many months. The mother notices this hesitation and quietly joins them. She says nothing. There are no words capable of easing such a moment. Instead, she simply reaches for the child's hand, not leading, not pulling, only reminding them that the first step, like every difficult step before it, need not be taken alone. Together they move outside. The air carries surprising weight. It is cooler than expected, touched by the freshness that follows overnight rain, and filled with scents almost forgotten. Damp soil, blossoming fruit trees, cut grass, distant smoke, and the faint sweetness of flowers opening beneath the morning sun. Birds sing from branches that appear impossibly high after so many months beneath low ceilings. Somewhere beyond the hedgerow a dog barks, followed by the familiar creaking of a wagon traveling along the road. These ordinary sounds no longer arrive through walls. They surround the family completely, reminding them that the world has depth once again. The children do not rush into the fields. They remain close to the house. The open space itself feels overwhelming. Months spent measuring every movement have quietly altered their understanding of distance. A few careful steps across the yard seem almost as significant as an entire day's journey once would have been. The youngest kneels beside a patch of grass, gently touching small white flowers growing unnoticed beneath the orchard trees. They smile without speaking, their fingers lingering upon petals that require no imagination now that they can finally be felt. The woman who sheltered them watches from the doorway. She does not interrupt. Throughout the long months of concealment, she had become accustomed to expressing care through practical tasks. Preparing meals, carrying water, gathering news, listening before opening hidden doors. Now those responsibilities begin slipping quietly away. In their place remains something simpler and somehow more profound, the privilege of witnessing another family stand once again beneath open sky. The mother turns toward her. For a long moment neither woman speaks. Language seems remarkably small beside everything they have shared. There had been mornings filled with fear, evenings marked by uncertainty, winters measured through scarce food and careful silence, summers endured beneath open windows where every sound demanded caution. Together they had preserved not only lives but also birthdays, lessons, stories, laughter whispered behind closed doors, and the ordinary dignity that persecution had tried so relentlessly to erase. Finally, the mother steps forward and embraces her. The gesture is quiet, almost restrained. It carries gratitude too deep for dramatic expression. No speech could contain the countless ordinary decisions that had made this morning possible. No words could fully acknowledge the months during which one household willingly accepted another family's fate as part of its own daily life. Beyond the orchard, the village slowly continues awakening. Neighbors sweep front paths. Children call to one another across gardens. Church bells ring the hour with calm familiarity, neither announcing victory nor mourning loss, simply continuing the work they had always performed. The world has not returned unchanged. It has merely begun again. And beneath the soft light of that ordinary morning, the hidden family takes its first careful steps into a future that no longer asks them to disappear, even though the memory of invisibility will remain quietly beside them wherever they go. Years pass, though not all at once. The seasons continue their patient work across the same fields where families once learned to lower their voices whenever strangers approached. Spring still covers orchards with white blossoms before summer deepens the leaves. Autumn gathers the harvest into barns whose timbers remember more than they can ever reveal. Winter returns with its familiar silence, laying snow across rooftops that once sheltered lives no passerby could have imagined beneath them. Nature keeps no archive of occupation. It simply continues, inviting each generation to begin again. The people do not recover with such effortless rhythm. The children who stepped carefully into that first open morning grow older carrying habits that no longer seem necessary yet never disappear completely. Some continue lowering their voices without realizing it whenever conversations become serious. Others find themselves listening instinctively before entering unfamiliar rooms. A sudden knock at the door may still interrupt an otherwise peaceful afternoon many years later, not because danger has returned, but because memory sometimes arrives more quickly than reason. The mothers carry different memories still. They remember not only fear, but responsibility. They remember calculating whether a loaf of bread would last another day, whether a cough could safely be allowed to continue, whether a frightened child required comfort or silence first. They remember inventing ordinary childhood inside extraordinary confinement, protecting curiosity without allowing it to become dangerous, preserving routines that seemed almost impossibly small while understanding that those routines quietly held entire families together. Many would rarely speak about these things afterward. Not because they had forgotten. Because some experiences resist becoming stories. How does one fully describe a year measured by footsteps overhead? Or explain the weight carried by a single whispered sentence after months spent guarding every sound? How does one tell a child that the room where they learned arithmetic, celebrated birthdays, and listened to bedtime stories existed because the world outside had decided they should no longer exist at all? Some hid their memories carefully, much as they had once hidden themselves. Others spoke only when younger generations began asking questions that deserved honest answers. Many never found language sufficient for either choice. The families who opened their homes carried another kind of remembrance. Visitors sometimes admired the old farmhouse or the modest city house without ever realizing what had once existed behind its walls. Children inherited furniture, kitchens, workshops, and gardens without immediately knowing that these ordinary places had once required extraordinary courage. Only years later would someone quietly point toward a false wall, an attic beam, a concealed cellar, or a narrow space beneath the floor and say, almost matter-of-factly, people lived there. The sentence often ended there. It hardly needed embellishment. The room itself completed the story. History naturally remembers conferences, campaigns, military victories, and political decisions because they altered the course of nations. Yet beneath those larger movements lived another history, one measured through cups of soup quietly divided, blankets folded every morning, arithmetic lessons continued beneath dim light, whispered lullabies replacing songs that could no longer safely be sung, and mothers who refused to allow fear to become the only inheritance their children received. You leave these homes quietly. The concealed rooms remain where they have always been, some preserved as places of memory, others long returned to ordinary use. Visitors may walk through them today noticing little more than rough timber, worn stone, narrow staircases, or ceilings lower than expected. Without the stories, they appear surprisingly modest. Perhaps that is the deepest lesson they offer. Human endurance rarely announces itself with grandeur. It often survives inside the smallest spaces. A hidden room, a shared loaf, a careful whisper, a hand reaching for another in the darkness, not because it can guarantee tomorrow, but because no child should have to face uncertainty alone. Outside, the wind moves gently through the orchard once more. Blossoms loosen from the branches and drift slowly across the grass before settling into the earth that has witnessed generations arrive, disappear, and begin again. Birds continue returning each spring to nests rebuilt upon familiar beams, guided by instincts that outlast every conflict. The morning light falls across old walls with the same quiet generosity it offered long before the war and long after it ended. The rooms are silent now. Not because no one remains. Because the lives once hidden within them have finally stepped back into the open air, leaving behind only the patient reminder that the greatest victories are not always won upon battlefields. Sometimes they are won each morning by those who quietly choose compassion over fear, endurance over despair, and love over the long shadow of hatred. You've been part of Echoes of War, where stories rise on quiet wings, and the past still circles above us, refusing to land.